I've always enjoyed the solitude of the wilderness. Something about the silence, the absence of city noise, makes me feel alive in a way that no crowded bar or bustling street ever could. The crisp air of the mountains, the scent of pine trees, and the distant sound of running water, those were the things I craved. I wasn't new to hiking or camping. I had spent years exploring the woods of the Pacific Northwest, and after hearing about a remote spot in Northern California, I decided to check it out. This place wasn't your typical tourist trail. You wouldn't find the usual crowds of backpackers or families with kids. It was far enough out of the way to feel almost untouched, a place where you could truly get away from everything. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to break over the horizon. The forest was still dark, but there was a quiet warmth to the light creeping through the trees. I wasn't in a rush. I never was. With my backpack secured and my gear in good shape, I set off into the woods, following the narrow trail that wound through the thick underbrush. I spent the day hiking, taking my time, enjoying the beauty around me. The deeper I went into the forest, the more at peace I felt. There was something magical about being so far from civilization. It wasn't about escape for me. It was about reconnecting. I wanted nothing more than the sound of my boots crunching on the trail and the occasional bird call to remind me I was alive. By late afternoon, I found a spot near a small stream. The water was clear, and the surrounding trees offered enough shelter to make a comfortable camp. It wasn't the most scenic place I'd ever set up, but it was quiet, and that was all that mattered. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and set up my camp. I even had a small campfire going by the time the sun started setting. As the evening wore on, the air grew cooler, and the forest seemed to settle into the rhythm of the night. That was when I noticed the other camper. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, but I must have missed him earlier when I was focused on setting up my camp. He appeared from behind a cluster of trees, moving slowly and quietly, like he was trying not to disturb the peace of the place. His face was weathered, with a few days of stubble and deep-set eyes that made him look older than he probably was. His clothes were worn but functional, and his pack was massive, the kind of pack that suggested he had been on the trail for a while. He didn't say much at first. We exchanged nods, and I offered him a seat by the fire. He accepted, and for a while we just sat in silence, watching the flames dance. I wasn't much for small talk, and he didn't seem to be either. But after a while he spoke. "Quiet out here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, taking a sip from my canteen. "That's the idea. It's why I come out here, to get away from everything." He gave me a faint smile but didn't respond. We both sat there, the fire crackling between us. After a moment, I noticed him staring into the flames, lost in thought. I didn't want to press him, but curiosity got the better of me. "What brings you out here?" I asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Just needed some space. Thought I'd get away for a while." I could tell he wasn't interested in sharing too much, and I wasn't about to pry. We spent the rest of the evening in comfortable silence, the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig the only sounds in the otherwise still night. When the fire died down, we both retreated to our tents, each of us left alone with our thoughts. The next morning, I woke early, the light of dawn filtering through the trees. My breath hung in the crisp morning air as I stretched and got ready to pack up camp. It was when I stepped out of my tent that I realized something was wrong. David, at least that's what he had told me his name was gone. His tent was still there, collapsed as though he had just crawled out of it, but there was no sign of him anywhere. No pack, no gear, nothing. I looked around the campsite, but everything was as it had been the night before, except for the absence of the other camper. It didn't make sense. I called out his name a few times, but the forest remained silent. I even walked around the edge of the camp, checking for footprints or signs that he had just wandered off. There was nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. My stomach twisted. I wasn't worried at first. Maybe he had left early, wanting to get a head start on the trail. But as the minutes passed, that nagging feeling of unease crept in. I knew something was off. David had been an odd guy, sure, but he was no different from the other solo campers I had met. I didn't expect him to just disappear. I packed up my camp, deciding I'd head in the same direction I had planned to go. But the further I walked, the more paranoid I became. It was too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I kept thinking I'd catch sight of David up ahead, or hear him calling from somewhere behind me, but there was nothing. The more I walked, the deeper into the woods I seemed to go. Every time I looked around, I saw the same trees, the same rocks, the same stretch of trail I had passed earlier. It was like I was walking in circles. The familiar landmarks had started to blur together, and the woods felt wrong. I stopped and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I was an experienced hiker, used to navigating through difficult terrain. I shouldn't be getting this paranoid. Yet, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I kept hearing things behind me. Footsteps, the snap of a twig. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. The trail I had been following had started to fade. It wasn't marked, just a narrow path carved through the underbrush, and now it was getting harder to follow. I thought back to the campsite, the spot where David's tent had been. Why hadn't he left anything behind? No sign of him, no note, nothing at all. I pushed on, hoping I was just overthinking things, but the deeper I got into the forest, the less certain I became. I began to wonder if I had missed a turn, if I had strayed off the path. It felt like the forest was closing in around me, and the more I searched for signs of David, the more I began to doubt my own sense of direction. Hours passed, and I still hadn't found anything. There was no trace of David, no trace of anything familiar. I was lost at my hands shook as I reached for my map, only to find that it had slipped from my pocket somewhere along the way. My heart pounded in my chest. I had no idea where I was anymore. The trail I thought I had been following had disappeared, and the woods around me seemed unfamiliar. The trees looked different, the shadows darker. I tried to retrace my steps, but the path seemed to shift, like the forest itself was playing tricks on me. The paranoia I had felt earlier grew, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was being followed. My breath came in short bursts, my head spinning. I wanted to scream, but I didn't dare. Then, just as the sun was beginning to set, I stumbled upon something. It was a small clearing, one I didn't recognize, but there, in the center, was something that made my blood run cold. A pile of rocks, arranged in a circle. The fire pit was cold, the ashes long dead. And standing there at the edge of the clearing was a figure, David. But something was wrong. His posture was stiff, unnatural, like he was waiting for something that I froze, staring at him. My legs felt like they were made of stone. My heart pounded, my mind racing. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot. David didn't turn to face me. He just stood there, unmoving, staring at the ground. The wind picked up, and the trees groaned as though they were alive, the sound echoing through the silence. Then, with a sudden jolt, I snapped out of my trance. I turned and ran, not looking back, not caring where the path led anymore. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. I eventually made my way back to the trailhead, disoriented and exhausted, but I was alive. The forest had swallowed my sense of reality for hours, playing tricks on me, but I was out now. And yet, as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I never found David again. I'm Emma, a 28-year-old hiker from upstate New York. I've always loved being out in nature, especially the Adirondacks. There's something about the quiet of the woods, the feeling of being far from civilization, that calls to me. After a few years of short day hikes and weekends spent camping, I decided it was time for a bigger challenge. A solo backpacking trip through some of the more remote parts of the Adirondack Mountains. I wanted to test myself, push my limits, and get a little peace and solitude in the process. I planned carefully. I'd been hiking for years, so I was confident in my skills. I knew how to read a map, use a compass, and I was well prepared with the right gear. The weather forecast had predicted mild conditions for the first few days, with a cold front moving in on day 3, so I made sure I was ready for whatever the mountains might throw at me. I'd packed light, but with enough to stay comfortable and safe. A tent, sleeping bag, food for the trip, and of course my phone, though I didn't plan on needing it much. I started my hike at sunrise, breathing in the fresh air and feeling the excitement of the trail beneath my boots. The first day was beautiful. The sky was clear, and the trails were well marked. I passed a few other hikers along the way, but mostly I was alone, just how I liked it. The woods felt alive, and I reveled in the sense of freedom. But by the second day, things took a turn. I had planned to stay on one of the more remote trails that looped through an area with fewer hikers. It was a part of the park I hadn't explored before, and I was excited to see something new. The trail markers became less frequent, and the path started to narrow. Still, I felt confident. This was part of the challenge, after all. That was when I made my mistake. I missed a turn. The signpost was small, barely noticeable, and I was too caught up in the beauty around me to pay close attention. I kept walking, thinking I was following the right path. It wasn't until I looked around and realized the surroundings were unfamiliar that I started to panic. The trees seemed thicker, the trail less distinct. I stopped and checked my map, then my compass. I knew something was wrong. My phone was dead, and I had left my charger at the bottom of my pack. I planned to conserve battery, so I hadn't bothered charging it that morning. Stupid mistake, I thought. I'd always been careful, always prepared. But now I was truly alone. The sky had been cloudy all day, and as the hours passed, the clouds thickened. By late afternoon, the wind picked up, bringing with it the first hints of rain. I could feel the temperature dropping, too. I had a jacket, but the cold wasn't what worried me. It was the growing uncertainty. Where was the trail? Had I gone off it entirely? How could I have been so careless? I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The forest felt endless. The trees stretched high above me, blocking out what little light there was. I could hear the rustling of the wind through the branches, the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots, and my own breathing quick, shallow. My heart raced. As the night drew closer, I knew I had to make camp. I found a small clearing and set up my tent quickly, my hands shaking from the cold and stress. I told myself that I'd figure it out in the morning. I just had to sleep and rest. But deep down, I knew I wasn't as prepared for this as I'd thought. The night was cold. The wind howled outside the tent, and the rain started to fall harder. I lay in my sleeping bag, wide awake, listening to every creak and groan of the forest around me. It was the kind of silence that could drive a person mad if they weren't used to it. And I wasn't used to it, not like this. My mind kept drifting back to the trail, to the mistake I'd made, and to the growing sense of unease. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I was jolted awake by the sound of someone moving outside my tent. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else, but it was enough to keep me alert. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to get back on the trail and find my way out of this mess. I could still hear the rain falling, but the sky had lightened a little. I tried to follow the direction I thought I'd come from, but nothing seemed right. Every turn led me deeper into unfamiliar woods. The more I tried to find my way, the more I felt like I was going in circles. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, too fresh. I squatted down to examine them, my heart pounding. They weren't big, but they were clear. A pair of boots, larger than mine, leading away from where I'd camped. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail before, and now this? A sense of dread washed over me. I tried to shake it off. Could have been anyone. Maybe another hiker, someone who got off the trail too. But the more I thought about it, the more it unsettled me. I hadn't heard anyone pass during the night, and I hadn't seen anyone yesterday. Who could it have been? I continued walking, more cautious now, but the sense of being watched never left. The sounds of the forest were all around me. Birds, the wind, the rain. But I kept hearing something else. Soft footsteps behind me, just on the edge of my hearing. When I turned to look, there was nothing, but my gut told me something was wrong. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. The weather hadn't improved, and I hadn't found the trail or any familiar markers. As I set up camp for the night, I felt like the forest was closing in on me. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and heavy. I hadn't seen a single person all day, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching me. I checked my tent, my gear, everything. My map was where I left it. My food was still in my pack. But then I noticed something strange. My water bottle, which had been right next to me when I set up camp, was now several feet away. My first thought was that I had moved it by accident, but when I checked my footsteps, I saw no sign that I had gone near it. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I found more signs, small things, but they made my blood run cold. A branch that had been in my path the day before was moved, now twisted in a way that didn't make sense. Another set of footprints, this time deeper, closer. Someone had been following me. I knew it. The worst part was that it wasn't just the footprints or the missing items. It was the way the forest seemed to change. The path I'd been walking was getting more and more difficult. Small, subtle changes. Rocks in the way, branches leaning toward me as though trying to guide me in the wrong direction. I tried to call out, hoping for a response, but there was nothing. No one was here, or if they were, they weren't responding. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I realized something. Whoever was doing this wasn't just following me. They were trying to make sure I couldn't leave. I wasn't just lost. I was being trapped. It was late September when Sarah and I decided to take a week-long hike along a remote section of the Appalachian Trail. We'd been talking about it for months, both craving the peace and quiet that only a remote trail could provide. There were fewer people out there, fewer distractions. It was exactly what we needed, just the two of us, the woods, and our thoughts. At least that's what we'd hoped. We parked at the trailhead just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The air was already cooling, and the scent of pine filled the air. It was beautiful, and I felt the weight of the city life slowly lift off my shoulders as we started our hike. The first couple of days were everything we'd expected. Crisp mornings, long days spent hiking through dense forests, and nights around a fire, listening to the crackle of the flames and the sounds of the woods. The trail was well marked, and we saw a few other hikers here and there, but nothing too crowded. We were truly out in nature. On the third day, things started to feel different. We were following the main trail when Sarah, always the more adventurous one, noticed an overgrown path that veered off to the side. It wasn't on our map, but it had that familiar, inviting pull that you sometimes get when you're far from civilization. "Let's check it out," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I was feeling restless too. The idea of exploring somewhere new, somewhere untouched, was hard to resist. We followed the narrow trail as it wound deeper into the woods. The path was rougher, with tall grass and bushes brushing against our legs. The further we went, the more the sounds of the forest around us seemed to fade, replaced by a strange quietness. Even the birds had stopped calling. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a clearing, and there it was, an old cabin. It sat alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a thick wall of trees. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging in places. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. Stood there for a moment, unsure whether to go closer. The place had an eerie feel to it, something off, but it also had a strange pull. I've always believed that abandoned places held stories, and this one was no different. We approached the cabin cautiously. The air felt heavier here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. As we stepped inside, the floor creaked under our weight, the dust thick in the air. The room was a mess. Furniture overturned, scattered belongings, a few empty cans on the ground. An old lantern sat in the corner, knocked over with oil still pooled around it. It was as if someone had been here, left in a rush, but for what reason? I walked further into the cabin, and my boots scraped against something sharp. Looking down, I saw broken glass, shards from a smashed picture frame. The photo was gone, but the frame itself was still there, cracked and abandoned like everything else. "This place is creepy," Sarah whispered, standing at the door and scanning the area outside. "We should probably leave." But I wasn't ready to leave yet. My curiosity had taken over, and I needed to know more. I moved through the cabin, my footsteps muffled by the dust and debris. Something about the place seemed wrong. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. The way everything was left in such a chaotic state, it didn't sit right. I turned to Sarah. "Maybe we should check outside, see if there's anything else." She nodded, reluctantly, and we stepped back out onto the porch. The air was colder now, the wind picking up, making the trees around us sway. That's when I saw it, a movement in the distance. A figure, barely visible between the trees, just standing there watching us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah followed my gaze, but by the time she looked, the figure was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice low. She nodded, her expression tense. "Who the hell would be out here?" I felt a chill run through me. It didn't make sense. The cabin was miles from the nearest trail, and the path we'd taken was barely noticeable. Who would be out here? "We should go," Sarah said, and I agreed. The tension between us was palpable, and the sense that something wasn't right grew stronger with every second. We started back down the overgrown path, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But as we walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The woods felt different now, more oppressive, the shadows deeper, the wind carrying a low, unsettling hum. We hadn't made it far when we heard it. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from behind us. Someone was following us. I grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to move. Now." We started running, our breath coming in short bursts, our feet pounding the earth beneath us. The trail was harder to follow now, the brush thicker, and it felt as though the trees were closing in on us. Every so often, I heard something behind us, a snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. By the time we reached the main trail, we were out of breath, our faces pale, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. Whoever was out there had followed us, and they were still close. We didn't stop. We didn't even look back. We just kept running until we reached the point where the main trail met a wider, more traveled path. There, we collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. For a long time, we sat there, not speaking, just listening. The only sound was the wind through the trees. No footsteps, no movement. But I knew, deep down, that whoever had been following us wasn't far behind. The rest of the hike was a blur. We didn't take any detours, didn't stop to enjoy the views. We just kept moving, the dread from that cabin still heavy in the air. By the time we made it to the next campsite, we were both exhausted mentally and physically. It wasn't until we were safely back home, far away from the trail, that we could talk about what happened. We never found out who had been following us, or why that cabin had been left so hastily. All we knew was that there was someone out there, someone who didn't want us to know what they were hiding. And as much as we wanted to forget about it, I knew we never would. Because some places aren't meant to be discovered. Some trails lead to more than just physical destinations. They lead to things that should stay buried. It was the weekend before finals, and I was on the edge. The last few weeks had been a blur of exams, papers, and endless cups of coffee. I had barely seen my best friend Hannah, and when I suggested we escape for a weekend camping trip to the Sierra Nevada mountains, she didn't need much convincing. She'd been just as stressed as I was. We were both 22, college seniors at the University of California, and we'd been friends since our first year. I had always been the more outdoorsy one, spending my summers hiking in the Adirondacks, camping in remote spots, and Hannah, well, she liked the idea of nature but didn't always enjoy the reality of it. But this time, she was on board. She packed her bags with a mixture of excitement and anxiety, both relieved and nervous at the thought of a break from everything. Plan was simple. Drive up to the mountains on Friday, hike on Saturday, and relax around the campfire at night. We'd be back by Sunday evening, ready to face finals head-on. No cell service, no distractions. Just the two of us and the wild. We left early Friday morning, making our way from our apartment in Reno, Nevada, into the mountains. The drive was smooth, with the sky clear and the temperature pleasant. The road wound through tall trees, open meadows, and rocky outcrops as we made our way toward a quiet campground in a remote part of the Sierra Nevada. It was the kind of place where you felt like you could disappear, which was exactly what we needed. By midday, we had set up our tent by a small creek. The air was fresh and cool, and the world seemed peaceful. We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the surrounding woods and hiking to a nearby viewpoint. We could see for miles, a breathtaking expanse of forests, snow-capped peaks, and the valleys below. We joked about how easy it was to forget everything when you were surrounded by such beauty. Felt like the perfect escape. As night fell, we built a small fire by our campsite, roasting marshmallows and talking about everything we'd been too busy to discuss in the past few months. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. The fire crackled, and the dark sky above was lit with stars. There was something magical about being so far from the world, just two college girls in the wilderness, trying to figure out what we wanted to do with our lives. But as the night deepened, I began to feel something strange. The woods around us, which had felt inviting earlier in the day, seemed a little too quiet. The usual sounds of nature were muted, almost like everything was holding its breath. I didn't mention it to Hannah, not wanting to ruin the mood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. We turned in early that night, the cold air nipping at our faces as we zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags. The tent was small but cozy, and we fell asleep quickly, tired from the day's activities. The next morning, we woke up to clear skies and a chill in the air. We were eager to start our hike, so we packed our backpacks with water, snacks, and the essentials. I made sure to grab the compass and GPS I'd brought along. Better safe than sorry, especially in a place this remote. The plan was to follow a trail that led deeper into the mountains. According to the map, it would take us to an isolated lake where we could relax and have lunch before heading back. The hike was supposed to take about 5 hours, so we didn't want to waste any time. We set off around 9 a.m., following the trail as it wound through the trees. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light on the ground. For the first couple of hours, everything went smoothly. We were laughing, taking pictures, and enjoying the natural beauty around us. But then, things started to get weird. I had been relying on my compass and GPS to keep track of our location, but suddenly, the compass needle began to spin wildly. I stopped and checked the GPS, but the screen was blank. At first, I thought it was just a malfunction. Maybe the batteries were low or the signal was lost. I tried resetting the GPS, but it didn't work. The compass was still useless, and the map didn't seem to match what I was seeing around us. Maybe we've gone off the trail a bit, I said, trying to stay calm. Let's just backtrack and see if we can find a landmark. Hannah agreed, and we retraced our steps for a while. But the more we walked, the more it felt like we were moving in circles. The trail markers, which had been easy to follow at first, seemed to be disappearing. We couldn't find any signs or familiar landmarks. The woods had begun to look different, darker, more enclosed. The trees were taller, and the trail seemed to narrow and twist in unexpected directions. We tried to use the map to get our bearings, but it didn't make sense. The map didn't match the terrain around us. I began to feel a creeping unease in my stomach, and I could tell Hannah was starting to get nervous too. We weren't lost, I told myself. It had to be a glitch, a simple mistake. But as we pressed on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder, and the sun, once bright, was now obscured by thick clouds. The trail had vanished completely, and we were just wandering through the woods, hoping for a sign of direction. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the temperature dropped even further. My thoughts began to race. What if we couldn't find our way back? What if we were truly lost? The peaceful wilderness I had loved so much just the day before now felt hostile, like it was trapping us. By the time the sun had set, we had no choice but to stop. We found a small clearing near a stream and set up camp as best we could. My hands were shaking as I tried to start a fire, and I could tell Hannah was just as scared. We huddled together by the fire, the shadows of the trees surrounding us like silent watchers. I don't know what's going on, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Something's wrong. The map, the compass. It's like the woods are shifting. Hannah didn't say anything at first, but then she spoke, her voice filled with uncertainty. Mia, I think we're being kept here. Someone's messing with us. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the forest was working against us. It wasn't just bad luck or malfunctioning equipment. Someone had been watching us, leading us deeper into the wilderness, keeping us from escaping. We stayed up all night, keeping the fire burning as best we could. Every snap of a twig in the dark made our hearts race, and every gust of wind through the trees felt like an ominous warning. I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually, exhaustion overtook us, and we fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, we woke up to a strange silence. The wind had stopped, and the world felt unnaturally still. We gathered our things quickly, desperate to find our way back. But when we stepped out of the clearing, the woods seemed completely different. There were no familiar paths, no landmarks to guide us. We were further off the trail than ever before. We kept walking, hoping to find something familiar, but the more we walked, the more we realized we were hopelessly lost. The trees closed in, the shadows deepened, and the landscape became increasingly unfamiliar. Every direction seemed the same. It wasn't until the late afternoon that we stumbled across something we hadn't expected. A small old cabin, half hidden in the trees. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It wasn't on the map, and it didn't belong here. But it was shelter, and that's all we needed. We took refuge in the cabin, barricading the door with whatever we could find. As night fell again, I knew that whatever had been keeping us here, whatever had been leading us deeper into the wilderness, was still out there watching. But for the first time in days, I didn't feel completely helpless. We didn't have a clear way out, but we were safe for now. The next morning, we made our way back to the trailhead, determined to get to civilization. The woods seemed to relent, and after what felt like an eternity, we finally found our way out. We stumbled back to our car, exhausted and shaken but alive. As we drove away, the weight of the wilderness finally lifted. We never figured out what happened that weekend. There was no one in the cabin. No one ever came forward to explain the strange things we encountered. But when I looked back at that weekend, I knew one thing for sure. The wilderness wasn't something to take lightly, and sometimes it has a way of holding you exactly where it wants you. We never went back to the Sierra Nevada. The sun had barely started to break over the horizon when we set up camp, the last stretch of our drive now behind us. The cool air of the Rocky Mountains kissed my skin, and the scent of pine filled my lungs. I had to admit, there was something calming about being here. The wilderness felt like the right place to reconnect with my son, Jake, after spending so many years away in the military. It had been a long, tough deployment, and I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap that had grown between us. This trip was meant to fix that. Jake was 16 now, almost a man, but still young enough to want adventure. I'd seen it in his eyes when he'd agreed to this trip. We both needed this time, but for different reasons. For me, it was a way to unwind, to breathe a little easier after years of constant vigilance. For him, I think it was about testing himself, proving something, whether to me or to himself, I wasn't sure. Our first night in the cabin was quiet, the kind of silence that only the wilderness can provide. We'd set up camp by a clear stream, nestled among the trees. It was perfect, peaceful. I tried not to think about the strange feeling in my chest, the sense of being watched, but it lingered. The morning came fast. I woke up before the sun, a habit I couldn't break, and stretched out in the tent. My body was sore from the drive, but it felt good to be out here, away from the hustle of the world. I stepped out into the cold, looking around. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were huge, much larger than any animal track I recognized, and they circled our tent, the edges still fresh with dew. Jake had woken up too and saw them. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Maybe it was a bear or something else, I thought. The mountain wildlife was unpredictable, but the footprints weren't right. Bears don't walk in a perfect circle around your camp. Still, I told Jake not to worry about it, to just keep an eye out. We spent the day hiking, and the further we went, the more unsettled I felt. The woods here weren't like the ones back home in Vermont. They felt older, denser, as though they had seen more than their share of history. By the time we got back to the camp, the strange footprints were gone, and I figured it was nothing. That night, as we settled into the cabin again, the unease crept back. I checked the perimeter of the camp, no sign of anything unusual. But when I went back inside, Jake was already sitting by the fire, staring out into the darkness. "Something's off, Dad," he said quietly, almost as though he were talking to himself. I didn't respond right away. I didn't want to scare him, but I felt it too. Something wasn't right here. We spent the evening in silence, the crackling fire our only company. The second night, we heard something. At first, I thought it was a bear rummaging through our supplies, but when I checked the area around the tent, nothing was touched. That's when it hit me. Someone was out there. Someone was watching us. I tried to stay calm. Could have been a hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost. But I knew in my gut that it wasn't. My years in the military taught me to trust my instincts, and something about the way the woods were quiet, unnervingly quiet, told me we weren't alone. The next morning, I decided to go further up the trail, away from camp. I needed to clear my head. Jake stayed behind, and I told him to keep the fire going and stay inside the cabin. But when I came back, I found something that stopped me cold. A torn piece of military gear, a patch that I recognized. It wasn't new, but it was unmistakable. It was from a squad I had served with, men who had vanished under strange circumstances years ago. I had never told Jake about that. He didn't know. He didn't need to. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I held the patch in my hands. There was no way this could be a coincidence. The thought that someone might be out here watching us wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a certainty. Jake came out of the cabin, his face pale. He didn't say anything at first, but when he saw the patch, his eyes widened. "Dad, what's going on?" "I don't know yet, Jake," I replied, my voice tight. "But we need to get out of here. Now." We packed up quickly, gathering what little gear we had left. I kept scanning the trees, feeling the weight of eyes on us from every direction. I wanted to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the evidence was piling up. The strange footprints, the missing food, the patch. Something wasn't right, and I was damn sure it wasn't just some animal. As we started down the trail, the woods behind us felt alive, watching us, waiting. It was a quiet pursuit, but it was a pursuit nonetheless. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf had me on edge. I didn't know if we were being followed or if it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but I wasn't about to take any chances. By the time we reached the car, I was convinced. Whoever or whatever had been out, there was no coincidence. I had survived too many close calls in my life to ignore that feeling of being hunted. And that patch, the one from the squad that had disappeared, was the final nail in the coffin. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Jake seemed shaken, and honestly, I was too. We'd been out in the wild long enough to know how quickly things could go wrong. But this felt different. This wasn't just a bad situation. It was a warning. That night, as we crossed the state line back into a more populated area, I felt the weight lift off my chest. The forest was behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't fully escaped. Whoever had been out there was still out there, somewhere in those woods, and they weren't going to forget about us. But we didn't look back. We just kept driving. I wanted this trip to be special, something different, something that would challenge Charlie, that would give him an experience he wouldn't forget. But I didn't plan for it to go like this. It was a cool, crisp fall weekend when I decided to take my 12-year-old son, Charlie, on a camping trip deep in the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont. We'd been on plenty of trips before, but this one would be different. Far from any marked trail, far from the usual spots where people camp, and far from anything resembling the comfort of a campground. I thought it would be a great way to teach Charlie some skills, to make him feel the weight of true wilderness. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The woods were dense, the trees towering and thick, the smell of pine sharp in the air. We hiked along the narrow trails, climbed over rocks, and built a fire at our campsite. The sun set low, and the forest took on that eerie quiet, where every sound seems amplified. Charlie and I sat around the fire, talking about nothing and everything, like we always did. He was excited but a little scared, which I liked. It meant he was paying attention. I wanted him to respect nature, to understand it wasn't something to take lightly. But that night, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but as the fire dwindled and the darkness took over, I had this nagging sense that we weren't as alone as we should have been. Maybe it was the wind, how it seemed to howl through the trees, or the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the usual forest sounds. Charlie fell asleep in the tent next to me, and I lay there, staring out through the small opening, listening. Eventually, sleep took me, but it wasn't long before I was awake again, heart racing. I don't know why I woke up, but something pulled me out of the haze of sleep. Maybe it was a noise. Maybe it was the dark that had crept in too deep. Whatever it was, I felt a shift in the air, a change I couldn't ignore. It was the second morning when things started to go wrong. Charlie and I packed up our gear after breakfast and decided to head deeper into the forest. There were no clear paths from here. Just us in the wild, no maps, no directions, just the trees and the rough terrain. I told Charlie to stick close, and he listened, mostly. We were only a couple of hours in when I noticed he wasn't by my side anymore. I turned around, calling his name, but no answer. I called again, louder this time. Charlie! Nothing. Panic crept up my spine. I could feel the blood draining from my face. I turned in circles, scanning the trees, the rocks, the trail. The woods had swallowed him up in an instant. I started walking, my heart pounding in my chest. Charlie! I shouted again, pushing through the dense underbrush. There were no answers, just the wind and the creaking of the trees. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, tightening around me. For what felt like hours, I retraced our steps, calling out, my voice hoarse and desperate. I tried to remember where he might have gone, where he could have wandered off to, but nothing made sense. He wasn't anywhere. I wasn't the type of person to panic, not normally, but this was different. This wasn't just getting lost in the woods. This felt like something had changed, like something was wrong. I had a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I pushed deeper into the woods, my eyes darting between the trees, the feeling that I wasn't alone growing stronger by the minute. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made me stop, freeze, listen. Was it him? Was it something else? And then, near a small riverbank, I saw something. A piece of clothing, torn, covered in dirt, and something red. My stomach lurched. I reached down, picking it up carefully. It was Charlie's jacket. The sleeve was torn, and there were small splashes of blood on the fabric. My heart stopped. I felt my hands tremble as I held the jacket, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a little scrape. This was serious. I shouted his name again, my voice breaking this time, but still no answer. Only the sound of the wind, louder now, as if the forest itself was mocking me. I knew at that moment I was in over my head. This wasn't some simple search for a lost kid. There was something else going on, something I couldn't explain. I started moving faster, more frantic, my mind racing with possibilities. But every step I took seemed to push me further into the heart of the woods. The further I went, the more I felt the tension building in my chest, the more my instincts screamed that I was being led somewhere. I pushed through the thick brush, the sound of the river louder now, almost deafening. I had to get to the other side. Maybe he'd crossed it. Maybe he was just disoriented. I could almost hear him, the faintest echo of his voice in my head. As I moved along the riverbank, I noticed something else. A trap, a snare, set high in a tree. I stopped, staring at it, confused. Who would set a trap in the middle of the woods like this? It was too well hidden, too carefully placed. I felt my throat tighten. I wasn't just searching for Charlie anymore. I was looking for something or someone that didn't want me to find him. I turned back, my mind racing. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, and the forest was growing darker, colder. It wasn't just the light fading, it was something else. It felt like something was stalking me now, watching my every move. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig sent me into a panic. And then I found it, another piece of Charlie's clothing. This time it was a shoe, but it wasn't just abandoned. It was ripped, shredded, like something had torn it off. I dropped to my knees, heart hammering, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. What was happening to him? Who or what was out here with us? I spent the next few hours searching, getting more and more desperate as I walked deeper into the forest. I couldn't give up. I wouldn't. But the deeper I went, the more I realized I was walking into something far darker than I could have imagined. And then I found it. At the edge of a clearing, I stumbled into a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked old, abandoned. The windows were shattered, the door half hanging off its hinges. There were signs of recent activity, though. I could see footprints leading in and out of the cabin, and there was something else. Something darker. I felt my heart rate spike. This wasn't just a place to hide from the elements. It was a trap. I crept closer, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Not without Charlie. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the darkness inside swallowing me whole. I stepped in, my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. I froze. There, in the corner, was Charlie. He was tied up, gagged, and unconscious, his body bruised and battered. My heart sank into my stomach. I rushed over, tearing at the ropes holding him, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As I freed him, I heard a noise behind me, a footstep. I spun around, but there was nothing. No one. Only the empty cabin, the broken windows, and the oppressive silence of the forest outside. I didn't wait. I picked Charlie up, ignoring the pain in my legs and back as I carried him out of the cabin. Something had been waiting for us, and now that it had what it wanted, I wasn't about to stick around and find out what else it had in store. We made it back to the campsite that night, both of us shaken, both of us changed. I didn't know what had happened out there or who or what had been behind it all, but I didn't care. All that mattered was that Charlie was safe, and that whatever that thing was, it was still out there in the dark, waiting. I told myself I'd never take him so far off the trail again. There was no adventure worth risking your life or your child's for. The woods had claimed its price that day, but I wasn't going to let it take any more. Not ever again. It's hard to believe how things got out of control so quickly. My friends and I had been camping for years. We'd been everywhere from the Adirondacks to the Rocky Mountains, but this time was different. We chose a spot in the Cascade Range, way off the beaten path. The place was remote, isolated, and even our GPS couldn't pick up a clear signal there. It sounded perfect. There was me, Ryan, 28, the one who usually took charge of setting up camp. Mark, 29, a more laid-back guy who always found a way to keep things light. And Sarah, 27, the one who had a sixth sense when it came to safety. We all knew the wilderness well, but something about this place had a feeling to it. I don't think any of us could put it into words at first, but as the day wore on, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. The weather was clear when we arrived, the sun shining down, with a soft breeze rustling the trees. The campsite was perfect, nestled between tall, old pines and a crystal-clear creek. We had all the usual camping gear with us: tents, sleeping bags, food, water, plus a few extras. I set up the tents while Mark started a fire and Sarah gathered some firewood. Everything felt like any other trip, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, there was something about the silence that didn't sit right with me. That night, as we sat by the fire, the forest around us seemed to close in. The sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves were the only things we could hear. No birds, no distant animal calls, just the eerie quiet. Mark laughed it off, making jokes about how we were getting soft. Sarah, however, wasn't laughing. She kept glancing into the trees as if something was lurking there, just out of sight. We all retired to our tents after a while. I remember lying there in my sleeping bag, staring at the shadows dancing on the canvas walls of the tent. The fire had long since burned out, and the darkness outside was complete. I was almost asleep when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and steady, crunching through the dry leaves. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something common. But as the sound grew louder, I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone was walking around our camp. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps circled our camp, moving slowly, carefully, almost like someone was trying not to make a sound, but failing. It wasn't like any animal I knew. I nudged Mark, who was sleeping beside me, but he didn't stir. I crept out of my bag, careful not to make a sound, and unzipped the tent just a crack. I couldn't see anything in the pitch-black night, but I could hear the footsteps now moving closer to our tents. I wanted to call out, but something held me back. If it was someone trying to sneak up on us, I didn't want to make them aware that we knew. So I waited, holding my breath, listening as the steps drew nearer. Then nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the silence returned. I couldn't sleep after that. I lay awake for hours, my heart racing, my mind running wild with possibilities. Could it have been another camper, a ranger, or something else? Morning came slowly, and when the first light of day filtered through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mark and Sarah were already awake, and they didn't mention anything about the footsteps. It wasn't until we started gathering our things for breakfast that I noticed the first sign of something wrong. Our food supplies, cans of beans, packages of jerky, the bread we'd brought, had been tampered with. Some of it was missing, and the rest was scattered around like someone had rifled through it. But there was something else. Footprints. Not animal tracks, but human-sized prints, barefoot and deep, like someone had been walking around our camp during the night. First, we tried to shrug it off. Maybe another camper was hungry, and we just hadn't seen them. But then, when we looked at the tracks, something about them didn't sit right. They circled the campsite, moving from one end to the other, like whoever it was had been observing us. I felt a chill run down my spine. No one else was supposed to be out here. We were miles from the nearest trail, and we hadn't seen anyone on our way in. Maybe it's just a prank, Mark said, trying to keep things light. I mean, this is Yellowstone. People do weird things out here. I wasn't convinced. Something felt wrong, and it had nothing to do with a prank.
I glänste over at Sara.
Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and she was staring at the forest, like she was waiting for something to move. Let's just pack up and head back to the car, Sarah said, her voice tight. I don't care if we were planning to stay another night. Something's off. I didn't argue with her. I agreed we should leave, but as we packed our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch underfoot made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, just out of sight. As we started to break down camp, we noticed something even stranger. The tracks weren't just around the food. They led deeper into the forest, away from the camp. Whoever had been watching us hadn't just been observing. They were going somewhere, and they hadn't left in a hurry. The tracks were careful, slow, as if the person had been making sure they weren't seen. We decided to follow the tracks. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe we should have just gotten in the car and left. But curiosity got the better of us. We spent the next few hours hiking through the forest, following the strange prints. It wasn't until midday that we came across something that made our blood run cold. A small, abandoned cabin, hidden deep in the woods. The place looked ancient, like it hadn't been used in decades, but the door was slightly ajar, and there was something unsettling about it. Mark and Sarah were hesitant, but I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, echoing through the forest. Inside, there was nothing but dust and decay. Old furniture, broken windows, and cobwebs everywhere. But as I stepped further into the room, I noticed something odd. A series of marks on the walls, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Suddenly, we heard a noise, a scraping sound coming from the far side of the cabin. We froze, staring into the darkness. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure stepped out. Not a person, but something far worse, skinny, wild-eyed, with unkempt hair and clothes torn from years of living in the woods. The smell hit us first, a combination of decay, sweat, and something worse. It was a man, or at least he used to be. He looked like he hadn't seen civilization in years. The way he moved, it was clear he was just as scared as we were, if not more. He backed away from us, eyes wide, muttering something under his breath, but we couldn't understand him. His language was strange, guttural. He was the one who had been watching us. "We need to go," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." We didn't wait to ask questions. We turned and ran out of the cabin, not looking back. The whole way back to the car, I kept thinking about the strange man. Had he been living in the woods all this time? Was he the one who had been following us? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. When we finally reached the car and started the engine, it was like a weight lifted off our shoulders. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching us as we drove away, as if the eyes from the woods were still on us, even from miles away. And maybe they always would be. The last leg of our trip was dragging on. We'd been on the road for days, hauling freight across the country. Doug and I, two old truckers, were used to the grind, but by the time we hit the Rocky Mountains, we were both itching for a break. We needed to stretch our legs, take a breather, and maybe get some sleep without the constant hum of the engine in the background. So we decided to pull off the highway and find a place to camp, far away from the noise of the trucks, the cars, and the gas stations. It was late afternoon when we found a spot, the kind of place you couldn't just stumble upon by accident. Secluded, tucked away behind a bend in the road, with nothing but trees and rugged terrain around. No one would bother us here. It felt peaceful, almost like we were the only two people left in the world. We parked the truck at the edge of the dirt road, and after a quick stretch, we got to work setting up camp. Doug and I were both familiar with the outdoors, though we didn't do much camping when we were on the job. That didn't stop us from having a good time. I threw up the tent while Doug started a fire, his face already red from the heat of it. We didn't talk much, just focused on getting things ready. It was nice to be away from the stress of driving, the constant clock ticking in our heads. For a while, it felt like we could relax. But then we heard it, a car engine sputtering, followed by the sudden screech of tires. It was a sound that didn't quite fit into the quiet of the mountains. I stood up and looked toward the road. It was odd to see anyone out here, especially a car. A couple was getting out of the car. The man was tall and thin, dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans. His wife was shorter, with dark hair and a nervous look on her face. They walked toward us, waving their hands. The man's face was already red from the sun, and there was a wildness to his eyes, like he'd been on the road for way too long. "Hey, you guys got a minute?" the man called out, his voice carrying through the air. Our car broke down, and we could really use some help. Doug and I exchanged a glance. Normally, we wouldn't even think about getting involved with strangers out here, but we figured we were in the middle of nowhere, and they looked like they needed help. It wouldn't hurt to give it a try. We walked over to the car, a rusted-up sedan that was clearly older than it should be. The engine was hot, smoke still rising from the hood. Doug popped the hood and took a quick look. I stayed back, watching the couple closely. They both seemed a little on edge, their eyes darting around the place as if they were scanning the woods for something or someone. "Doesn't look like we can do much here," Doug muttered after a few minutes of poking around. "This car's done for." The man sighed, wiping his forehead. "Yeah, I thought so. I've been trying to get it fixed for months now. Just can't catch a break." Doug glanced at the woman. She hadn't said much so far, just stood by the car, looking uncomfortable. There was something off about the way she kept her distance from the woods, her eyes flicking nervously toward the trees, as if she was worried something might be lurking just beyond the tree line. "Can't you call someone?" I asked. "Too far out," the man said, shaking his head. "There's no tow service for miles." That was the first thing that struck me as odd. We were deep in the mountains, but there were a few towns nearby. The nearest tow company couldn't have been more than 50 miles away. Still, I didn't want to argue with the guy. It was clear they were in a tough spot. "Look, we're camping just up the road," I said. "If you want, you can stay with us for the night. We've got plenty of room, and I'm sure it'll be safer than waiting out here." The man hesitated, glancing at his wife, who seemed to give a small nod of approval. After a moment, he agreed. "Thanks. We'd really appreciate it." We led them back to our campsite, where Doug quickly set up a spare sleeping bag by the fire. We offered them some water and canned food. They didn't say much, just ate in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. I kept my eye on them too, but I couldn't quite figure out what was off about the whole situation. They were too quiet, too distant. As night fell, the sounds of the forest took over. The crackling of the fire was the loudest thing we could hear, but there was something else too. A feeling that the air was thicker here, like the trees were watching us. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. It had been a long drive after all. Doug went to bed early, falling asleep right away. I stayed by the fire, poking at the logs, trying to keep my mind busy. But the couple, especially the man, kept pacing around the campsite, his eyes darting from one corner of the woods to the next. That's when I started to notice the little things. The man and his wife seemed to know the area too well, like they'd been here before. They talked about the terrain as if they were locals, mentioning places by name that no one would have known unless they'd spent a lot of time here. I'd lived in the area for years, and I'd never heard of half the spots they brought up. Around midnight, I noticed something else, something that didn't add up. The man had told us his car had broken down, but when I looked over at the vehicle, I could see there was no sign of a tow truck anywhere. No tracks in the dirt, no sign of any help having come by. It didn't make sense. If the car had really been stranded for so long, someone would have come to take it away, right? But no one had. I walked over to the car, trying to figure out why it was still there. The couple wasn't paying attention to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There were no fresh tire tracks in the dirt. The car hadn't been there long. It looked almost like it had been parked on the side of the road for a few hours at most. Then, just as I was about to return to the campfire, I saw something that froze me in place. A pair of headlights in the distance, slowly moving toward us. I stood there, frozen, watching the lights creep closer. It didn't take long to realize that they were not from a tow truck. The vehicle was moving way too slowly, and there was something off about the way the lights cut through the night. I turned around and quickly made my way back to the campsite. When I got there, the couple had already packed their things, as if they'd been waiting for something. I asked them if they were leaving, but they didn't answer, just kept glancing at the road, as if they were expecting someone or something. It was then that it hit me. They weren't stranded. They had never been stranded. Everything about their story was a lie. The car wasn't broken down. They weren't lost. They were waiting for something, waiting for whoever had been driving that car. I turned back toward the road, and in the distance, the headlights grew brighter. They were almost on top of us now. My heart started to race. Something wasn't right. I turned to Doug, shaking him awake. We had to get out of there. We grabbed our gear as quickly as we could, not daring to speak. The couple didn't move. They didn't even look at us as we packed up. We were just about to leave when the car pulled up to the campsite, the headlights finally blinding us. The door opened and a man stepped out. I couldn't make out his face, but there was something unsettling about his silhouette. The couple stood there silently, as if this was all part of the plan. They exchanged a glance with the man, and he nodded once. Doug and I didn't wait around to see what happened next. We got in the truck and took off, not bothering to look back. The last thing I saw was the strange man walking toward the campfire, his face still hidden in the shadows. By the time we made it back to the main road, I didn't feel safe until we were 100 miles away. Doug didn't say a word the whole time. I didn't either. Neither of us needed to. We both knew that what had happened out there wasn't just a coincidence. Those people weren't lost. They weren't in trouble. They were just waiting for something, and we were lucky we left when we did. After all, in the mountains, you don't just meet strangers who need help. Sometimes, the people who seem the most lost are the ones who've got something planned all along. The sun was setting behind the tall pines, casting long shadows across the forest floor as Evan, unloaded our gear from the back of our truck. Beside me, my wife, Sarah, was unpacking the tent, a big smile on her face. This weekend was meant to be perfect, a break from our hectic lives, just the two of us in a quiet corner of the world. We'd chosen this spot for that very reason. It was a secluded area in a lesser-known national forest, deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, far away from the crowds. We had camped in other forests before, but this place felt different, felt untouched. We had been planning this trip for months. Sarah, a nature lover just like me, had always wanted to spend a quiet weekend in the wild, and this place seemed like the perfect retreat. There were no roads or trails leading through the area, just miles of thick forest and some old logging tracks that were barely used. We had picked it because we thought it would be peaceful, just us and nature, far from civilization. By the time we had the tent set up and a small campfire going, the sky had turned dark. The stars were so bright above us that it felt like we could reach up and touch them. The air was crisp, and the only sounds we could hear were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. It was exactly what we needed. We sat by the fire, talked, and ate a simple dinner of camp food, enjoying the peace and quiet. But something was off. At first, I thought it was just the isolation, the kind of feeling you get when you're far from any source of noise, the kind that makes every little sound feel bigger. But as the night wore on, I noticed that even the usual sounds of the forest were missing. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, nothing. It wasn't exactly silent, but it was still in a way that made my skin crawl. Sarah had noticed it too. "Isn't it strange how quiet it is tonight?" she said, her voice low as she stirred the fire. I nodded, though I didn't know what to say. "Maybe it's the altitude," I offered, trying to sound casual. "We're pretty far up here, so it could be the weather or something." She didn't say anything, but I could see she was still uneasy. We sat there for a while longer, the crackling fire our only companion, before finally crawling into our sleeping bags. Despite the stillness of the night, sleep came easily to both of us, but my dreams were filled with restless images. Faces in the dark, eyes watching us from the shadows. I woke up a few times, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving. The next morning, I woke up first, the gray light of dawn filtering through the trees. It was unusually cold, and I could see my breath in the air. Sarah was still sleeping, so I decided to get up and get the campfire going again. But as I stepped outside the tent, I was struck by the silence. The forest was unnervingly still. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, nothing, just quiet. I stood there for a moment, feeling like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I shrugged it off. Maybe the weather was changing, or maybe the forest was just in a rare, quiet moment. Either way, I didn't want to let it ruin our trip. I went about getting the fire going, but as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When Sarah woke up, we had a quick breakfast of granola and coffee before setting off for a short hike to explore the area. The air felt cold, and the quiet around us was heavier than before, but we tried to ignore it. After all, we were in the woods. It wasn't unusual for there to be moments of stillness. We wandered for a couple of hours, taking in the sights, the towering trees, the small streams, the moss-covered rocks. It was beautiful, and I could see Sarah's spirits lifting as we walked. But as we made our way back to the campsite, something caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, near the truck, were fresh tire tracks, wide and deep, leading off into the trees. The tracks weren't from our truck. We hadn't seen another vehicle on our way in, and there was no reason anyone else should be out here. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you think someone else is out here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah's face was pale. "It doesn't look like it's been here long. Maybe they're nearby." I didn't say anything, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We went back to the camp and tried to push the thought out of our heads, but every time I looked at those tire tracks, I couldn't stop wondering who else could be out there and what they wanted. The rest of the day went by without incident, but the eerie quiet remained. We spent the evening around the campfire again, trying to make the best of things. But that night, as we lay in the tent, the unease was still there, gnawing at me. I lay awake, listening to the silence, straining to hear any sounds from the forest, but there was nothing. Just an oppressive quiet that made my heart beat a little faster than usual. I don't know when I fell asleep, but the next morning was when things really started to get strange. The food we'd left out the night before was gone. Our bread, our fruit, the open jar of peanut butter, everything was missing. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten into it, but then I noticed something else. The camp was different. The chairs we'd left out were now positioned in odd places, facing away from the fire pit, and our backpacks had been moved. The zipper on one was open slightly, just enough to make me feel uneasy. Sarah noticed too. "Did you move the chairs?" she asked, her voice shaky. "No," I said, my voice tight. "I didn't move them." We stood there for a moment, both of us looking around the camp, the growing sense of dread pooling in my stomach. I didn't want to say it out loud, but the truth was clear. Someone had been here, someone who had been watching us, and now they were gone. We didn't talk much after that, but the silence between us was heavy. I thought about the tire tracks again, and the strange feeling that had been hanging over us since we first arrived. I looked over at Sarah, who was staring off into the trees, her face pale and tense. She didn't have to say anything. I could see the fear in her eyes. We both knew we weren't alone. We decided to leave. There was no point in staying, not when every instinct in my body was telling me that something was wrong. But as we packed up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A fresh set of tire tracks leading up to our campsite. The tracks were from a different vehicle this time. Smaller, more nimble, like someone had followed us in, keeping their distance, waiting for the right moment. I couldn't get the truck packed fast enough. My hands were shaking as I threw everything into the bed, and we rushed to get the tent down and the fire snuffed out. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I noticed something else. There was a figure in the distance, standing just at the edge of the tree line. I couldn't make out their features, but I could see them watching us, waiting. I didn't say anything to Sarah, but I started the truck and drove off as fast as I could, not looking back. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, hours away, and even then we stayed in the truck, too scared to go inside the diner. It wasn't until much later, after we had calmed down, that we realized something else. No one had been there when we had set up camp. We hadn't passed anyone on the road in, the last day. And yet someone had been out there watching us, following us. We never found out who it was. But that silence, that unnerving stillness of the forest, stayed with us long after we left. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, watching, waiting for us to return. I I had been dreaming of this moment for years. The city had taken its toll on me. Stress, noise, the endless rush of life. I needed to escape, to disappear into the woods for a while. Hiking had always been my sanctuary. I had hiked the trails of the Adirondacks, the Rockies, and even the Cascades. But this time, I chose a quieter place. A secluded mountain range in the northeast, far away from the hustle and bustle. The plan was simple. I would take a week off, hike alone, and reset. No phone service, no distractions, just me, the trail, and the wild. I had carefully prepared for this trip for months, checking my gear, reading guides, making sure I was physically ready. I trusted myself. I had hiked solo many times before, and nothing ever went wrong. The morning I set out, the air was crisp, and the scent of pine trees filled my lungs. I stood at the base of the mountain, my heavy pack settled comfortably on my shoulders. The trail stretched out before me, winding up into the dense forest. I had the whole place to myself, or so I thought. I took a deep breath and set off, the sound of crunching gravel beneath my boots the only noise. I moved quickly at first, eager to cover some ground. The first few hours were easy. The trail was well marked, the path wide and smooth. I passed through stretches of forest, the towering trees casting long shadows across the trail. The occasional rustle of leaves and the chirp of birds overhead were the only sounds that broke the silence. It was peaceful, just what I needed. But as the day wore on, things started to change. I had stopped for a short rest when I noticed something strange. A mark on a nearby tree, scratches, as if something had clawed at the bark. It looked fresh, like it had been made recently. My heart skipped a beat, and I brushed it off. Perhaps it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I pushed on, telling myself I was overthinking it. After all, I was experienced, and the woods had never scared me before. The sun began to dip lower, and I knew I would need to find a good spot to set up camp soon. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. I froze mid-step, my heart thudding in my chest. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The trail behind me was empty. I listened carefully, straining to hear anything, but the footsteps had stopped. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. Could have been anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept moving, glancing over my shoulder every now and then, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail remained empty. As the light started to fade, I found a suitable spot for camp. The trees here formed a natural clearing, and I set up my tent quickly, eager to be off the trail. I built a small fire and cooked a quick meal, all the while feeling like there was something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, certain I heard noises outside my tent. Branches snapping, the rustle of leaves, and once, a strange tapping sound against the side of the tent. I sat up, heart racing, but when I unzipped the flap and looked outside, there was nothing there. The next day, I continued my hike, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled into my bones. I was beginning to question if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, things took another turn. I had been following the trail markers, simple yellow paint marks on the trees, when I noticed something off. The markings on one of the trees were different, scratched into the bark, not painted. Pattern I didn't recognize. I stopped and stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. It was like someone had gone off the trail, marking the trees as they went. The further I hiked, the more I started to see these strange markings. It was like someone had been following the same path, but in reverse. Every few miles, I'd see another mark, each one more bizarre than the last. My heart pounded harder with each step. Was someone else out here? Was I being followed? When I made camp that night, I went over the events in my head. I had to be careful, couldn't let my guard down. But the longer I thought about it, the more I convinced myself it was all a coincidence. I had been hiking for days, and it was normal to encounter strange things in the wilderness. But the next morning, everything changed. I woke up to find my trail markers were gone. Not just the painted ones, but the ones I had left behind myself. My own markers, bits of fabric tied to branches, and small stones stacked to guide my way were all missing. In their place, there were new markers different from anything I had seen before. Scratches on the trees, twisted branches, and what looked like footprints. I felt my stomach drop. The feeling of being watched hit me like a brick. Someone had been tampering with my trail markers. I tried to remain calm, but my mind raced. Could it be a hiker who had lost their way? Was I just paranoid? Or was someone actively playing tricks on me? The thought of someone intentionally leading me off course made my skin crawl. To make matters worse, my food supply was gone. I had a stash of freeze-dried meals and snacks in my backpack, but when I checked, it was empty. There was no sign of the food being taken, no torn packaging, no traces of animal activity. It was just gone. I spent hours retracing my steps, hoping to find some clue, but the trail markers had been switched around. I was going in circles, unsure of where I was. The world around me felt smaller, closing in, as if the mountains themselves were watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. It was at that moment I realized the truth. Someone had been following me. Someone had been here the whole time. I wasn't alone. I don't know how much time passed before I found the cabin. It wasn't marked on the map, and I certainly hadn't seen any signs of it before. But when I stumbled across it, hidden in a small valley, tucked away behind a thick wall of trees, I felt a mix of dread and relief. There was shelter, a roof over my head, and a chance to get some rest. But when I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The cabin had been abandoned for years, but there were signs of recent activity. A fire had been lit in the stove recently. There were fresh footprints on the floor, and most unsettling of all, there was a wall covered in sketches, crude drawings of hikers and trees. Some of them looked like they were drawn from memory. Others looked like they had been drawn while watching someone from the shadows. I had no choice. I stayed the night in that cabin, my eyes darting to every noise in the dark. The sound of footsteps, faint but growing closer. Something or someone was watching from the woods. I couldn't stay there forever. The next morning, I gathered my things, leaving the cabin behind. The rest of the hike was a blur. My mind was focused solely on survival. Every step was filled with dread, each one a race against whoever or whatever was out there. When I finally reached the ranger station, I was exhausted, shaken, and more than a little paranoid. I had never been so relieved to see another person in my life. The ranger listened to my story, his face hardening as I spoke. He told me that a hiker had gone missing in those woods a few years ago. No one had ever found him. They suspected foul play, but no one knew for sure. All I knew was this: I wasn't the first person to disappear out there, and I wouldn't be the last. The mountains held secrets, dark, twisted secrets, and some things are better left undisturbed. I've known my friends for years, and when we decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods, it was supposed to be a fun getaway. No cell phones, no distractions. Just us, the forest, and a few days to rekindle some old memories. We were all in our 30s now, so life had shifted for each of us. Most of us were settled with families, jobs, and responsibilities. But this weekend was about getting away from all that, to laugh like we used to and forget about everything else. The cabin was tucked away in the dense woods outside of Asheville, North Carolina. It was an old house, weathered and creaky, but perfect for what we had in mind. We weren't expecting luxury. In fact, we were all excited by the rustic look of it. rough wood beams and a fireplace that probably hadn't been used in decades. It felt like we were stepping into another world, a time before our busy lives took over. There was Sarah, who had just gone through a rough breakup. She'd been distant lately, not her usual bubbly self. It was clear that she needed this trip more than anyone. I could tell she was going through something heavy, but she didn't talk about it. That's why I figured this weekend would be good for her. To get away, get some fresh air, and maybe work through her thoughts without all the distractions of the city. Then there was Brian, the one who had never really grown up. The life of the party, always cracking jokes and making everyone laugh. But even he seemed off in a way I couldn't explain. His laugh didn't carry the same weight it used to, and he wasn't quite as playful. Maybe it was the stress of work catching up with him, or maybe just the passing of time. Whatever it was, I could feel a shift in the dynamic. Maggie and Leo, the couple who were basically inseparable, were both in their mid-30s now, just like the rest of us. Their relationship was solid, but they had their own set of issues, especially when it came to career decisions and starting a family. It was one of those situations where they seemed happy but weren't quite on the same page about the future. I didn't know what would come of it, but I could see the cracks beneath the surface. The little things, looks, comments that didn't quite align made me wonder. The first day passed without incident. We explored the area around the cabin, went on a small hike, and cooked a big dinner together. It was exactly what I expected, a relaxing, easygoing day. But things began to shift that night. It was the first time we started hearing things. Small noises at first, branches breaking in the distance, what sounded like footsteps in the dry leaves just outside the cabin. Everyone brushed it off, chalking it up to wild animals or the wind, but the uneasy feeling lingered in the air. As the night settled in, we all gathered around the fireplace to drink and chat. We hadn't talked this much in years, and I could feel that old camaraderie starting to come back. Sarah, however, was quieter than usual. She didn't join in the conversation much, and I caught her staring out the window a few times, her expression distant, almost lost. The firelight flickered across her face, casting shadows in strange places. I didn't want to push her, so I let her be, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whole cabin felt off. It wasn't just the isolation, though that certainly played a part. The place had a certain air to it, a feeling of being watched, though I couldn't put my finger on why. That night, things started disappearing. It started with small things. Food gone missing from the kitchen, a knife that we couldn't find. We were all sitting around the table when I noticed that some of the snacks were gone. At first, I thought maybe someone had eaten them without thinking, but there was no way we'd finish them that fast. The next morning, the door to one of the bedrooms was locked from the inside, even though no one had locked it. No one had been in there. It was the same room Sarah had been sleeping in. We asked her if she'd locked it, but she seemed confused. She didn't remember doing it. There was an odd tension between us, an unspoken understanding that something wasn't right. We kept our voices low when we spoke, and there was an undeniable sense that we were being watched. But when we looked out the windows, we saw nothing but trees, the thick woods surrounding us. No sign of anyone. Later that evening, as we were preparing dinner, things took a turn for the worse. We noticed that the kitchen, which had been cleaned earlier, looked like someone had been rummaging through it. The stove was on, but the flame was low. Someone had been there, but no one had been outside. We checked each other's faces for signs of guilt or discomfort, but everyone seemed genuinely confused. Who did this? Leo asked, though it sounded more like a challenge than a question. I glanced at Sarah, who was standing in the corner, her arms crossed. She seemed different, almost too still, like she was trying to hide something. None of us, Brian replied, his voice tight. I thought we locked up before dinner, but I could see the way Maggie looked at Leo, then at Sarah, then at the door. They didn't say anything, but there was a shift. It was like something unspoken had entered the room. I tried to keep my cool. All right, we're all a little on edge. It's probably just the isolation messing with us. Let's just finish dinner, okay? But that night, things only got worse. As we settled into bed, I kept hearing small noises, scratching sounds from outside, like something was trying to get in. Then there was a knock, a soft tap on the door. I froze, staring at the door, waiting for it to happen again. But it didn't. The silence was deafening. Around midnight, I heard someone getting out of bed. It was Sarah, though I didn't know why she would be up. I followed her silently, not wanting to confront her directly. She moved towards the door, then stopped at the window. There was a pause, and I watched her through the crack in the door. She was staring out into the dark. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Then, without warning, she turned and walked back to her room. But I heard the door to the porch creak open just after that. I rushed to the window and looked outside. In the distance, I could see shadows moving, figures just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but the shapes were unmistakable. I woke everyone up. "We're not alone," I whispered. But when they looked out, there was nothing there. No movement. Nothing. The rest of the night was restless. No one slept. In the morning, we found more signs. The locks on the doors had been tampered with. Items in the kitchen had been moved again. But this time, there was a note. Just a single line of scribbled handwriting on a piece of paper left on the table. Asterisk, "We see you." Asterisk, the tension was unbearable. I didn't know what to do. The others started looking at each other differently. It wasn't just the cabin anymore. It was the people. Maggie and Leo were suspicious of Sarah of Brian, and I had my doubts about all of them. We started asking each other questions, but no one had any answers. As the day wore on, we realized the trap we were in. The roads leading out of the cabin had been blocked, not by trees, but by something more deliberate. Someone had done it. There was no way out. We were stuck. Then, that evening, just before nightfall, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was there, and they weren't trying to hide anymore. It was too late to run, so we barricaded ourselves inside. It was clear that one of us wasn't who they claimed to be. The fear of being trapped in the cabin with someone who might want to hurt us, it was too much. The isolation, the manipulation of the locks, the missing food, it all pointed to one conclusion. Someone here had a plan all along. But which one of us? In the end, it wasn't the strangers outside we had to fear. It was the fear of what had already been inside us. It started like any other camping trip. My girlfriend, Emily, and I, both in our late 20s, had been itching for a weekend getaway to explore the outdoors. We'd grown tired of the city's constant noise and smog, and the thought of fresh air, towering trees, and a peaceful night by a crackling fire sounded like the perfect way to escape the grind. We had always been the adventurous type, always taking road trips, exploring hidden gems, and even tackling a few backcountry trails. But this trip, we decided, would be different. We wanted something remote, something off the beaten path, away from the crowds and the noise. After some research, we found a spot deep in a forest not far from where we lived. It was known for its natural beauty but had very few visitors. A true escape, the perfect place to unwind. We spent hours carefully mapping out our route, making sure we knew exactly where we were going. We checked the trail markers, read reviews from others who had ventured there, and even bought a topographic map to ensure we didn't get lost. We were prepared, at least that's what we thought. The first day of the trip was perfect. The weather was warm but not too hot, the sun shining through the dense tree canopy, creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the ground. We parked our car at the trailhead, packed our bags, and set off. The forest smelled fresh and earthy, the kind of scent you only get after a rain. Birds chirped high above, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush made it clear we weren't the only ones out here. We hiked for hours, the trail winding through towering pines, over streams, and past craggy rocks. It was peaceful, and with every step, we felt more connected to the land. We talked about everything and nothing. Our future, the things we wanted to accomplish, the little annoyances that city life throws at you. Everything felt right. By the time we set up camp, the sun was low on the horizon, casting an orange glow over the landscape. That night, we cooked dinner over the campfire, the sound of sizzling food and crackling wood filling the air. We joked, shared stories, and watched the stars slowly appear above us. There was nothing out here but us, the fire, and the darkening forest around us. The kind of quiet you can only find in the wilderness. It was exactly what we needed. But things began to change on the second day. We woke up early, eager to explore further. The sky was still hazy with the remnants of morning fog. The air was cooler, a sign that autumn was settling in. We packed up our camp and decided to follow a small trail that we had spotted the day before. It wasn't on our map, but we figured it was just another offshoot of the main trail. We weren't concerned. After all, we had been careful with our planning. As we followed the path, we noticed something strange. The markers, usually small metal signs nailed to trees, didn't seem to match the ones on our map. The trail was still clear, but the markers looked older, more worn. It felt like they'd been there longer than they should have. Emily noticed it first. She stopped and pointed to one marker that had a strange symbol on it, one neither of us recognized. "Didn't this one look different yesterday?" she asked. I looked at it, then at the other markers ahead of us. Something about them didn't sit right. They looked too old, too out of place. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just another quirky thing in the woods. "Maybe it's a custom trail someone set up for a short hike," I said, trying to reassure her. But as we continued on, things felt off. The forest grew unnervingly silent. The chirping of birds and rustling of leaves faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. We'd been hiking for hours by this point, but the deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting in strange shapes as if they were reaching toward us. Emily was beginning to feel uneasy too. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her pace quickening. We stopped for a break, sitting down on a fallen log. The quiet was suffocating, and it was getting harder to shake the feeling that we were being watched. "I don't like this," Emily said quietly, her voice tense. "The trail doesn't feel right." I agreed. There was something about the markers, the air, and the stillness that had shifted in a way that made me uncomfortable. It felt as if we were being pulled deeper into the forest, and every step felt more deliberate than the last. After a short rest, we decided to turn back. But when we retraced our steps, something had changed. The markers weren't where they had been. The trail had shifted, the once clear path now almost impossible to follow. We walked for what felt like hours, but the trail kept fading, as if it had been erased from existence. "I don't understand," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "We should have been back by now." I pulled out our map, but it didn't help. The terrain didn't match anything we'd seen before. The paths weren't where they were supposed to be, and none of the landmarks we had passed earlier were visible. The woods felt different now, darker, colder, and the silence was no longer peaceful. It felt oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. We kept walking, trying to retrace our steps, but the more we moved, the more lost we became. My stomach churned with anxiety as the trees seemed to close in tighter around us. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We were running out of daylight. Emily's voice broke through the stillness, shaky and scared. "We've been here before," she said, her eyes wide with fear. This wasn't here before." She was pointing to a small, dilapidated cabin in the distance. It was so overgrown with vines and moss that at first, I hadn't noticed it. I hadn't seen anything like it on the map or the trails. It seemed so out of place. It was then that a cold dread washed over me. This wasn't part of the trail. It was like we had walked into a different time or a forgotten corner of the woods. The place felt abandoned, lonely, and yet, something about it didn't feel empty. "Let's get out of here," Emily said, her voice trembling. "This isn't normal. We need to leave." But I wasn't sure which way was out anymore. I had no idea where we had come from or where we were going. The forest had become a maze. We had no GPS, no signal, and we were both starting to panic. We turned away from the cabin, hoping to find our way back to the car. But the forest only seemed to deepen, pulling us further in. We walked for hours, the shadows growing longer and darker, the forest thicker and more confusing. The air grew colder, and every sound felt amplified. The crack of a twig underfoot, the wind in the trees, the distant sound of something moving in the brush. We kept calling out to each other, but it felt like the forest was swallowing our voices. The trees seemed to bend and twist, their shapes becoming more distorted the longer we walked. It was hard to tell how much time had passed, but the growing panic in my chest told me it had been too long. Eventually, we stumbled across a trail marker that actually looked familiar. It wasn't much, just a faded metal sign, but it was enough to make my heart race. We followed it cautiously at first, as if we weren't sure we could trust it. But it led us to the trailhead, and from there, we found our way back to the car, exhausted and shaken. I don't know what happened out there, whether we had been lost, or if we had somehow wandered into a part of the forest that wasn't meant to be found. I'll never know. All I know is that the feeling of being watched, the wrongness of the markers, and the sudden, overwhelming silence will stay with me forever. When we finally got back to civilization, I checked the map again, but I couldn't find the trail we had been on. There was no sign of that cabin, no trace of the markers we had followed. It was like the whole thing had disappeared. We never spoke about it again, but we both knew. We had been somewhere we shouldn't have been, and we were lucky to have made it out. It was a crisp morning in early October when I decided to head out for my annual hunting trip. I'm a seasoned hunter, been at it for over 30 years now. The forest around me, thick with pine and oak, had always felt like home. I had been to this spot countless times before, and I knew the terrain like the back of my hand. Still, there's a thrill in the hunt, and I was hoping this year I could bag a big buck. My chances had been slim the past few seasons, and I wasn't getting any younger. But I knew I had the skills and the experience. I wasn't worried about the usual challenges. I knew how to track, how to set up a camp, how to survive in the woods. But I was starting to feel the weight of my age. At 58, I could still move, but my knees weren't as quick as they used to be. My stamina wasn't what it once was, and my back ached more than I liked to admit. But this trip, I thought, would be different. This time, I was going to take down the biggest buck I'd ever seen. The first day went by without issue. The sun was low in the sky when I decided to head back to camp, a small, weathered cabin hidden deep in the woods. I'd hunted this area so often, I had a small spot I could rely on, a place to make camp and rest after a long day of tracking. It was remote, far enough from the nearest town, and as close to the wilderness as you could get. I'd spent nights there alone, sitting by the fire, listening to the wind howl through the trees, knowing that the forest was a world unto itself, where man was a guest. That night, I cooked a simple meal over the fire, venison jerky and beans, before turning in. As usual, I set my alarm to wake me up before dawn. The hunt wasn't over yet. The next morning, things didn't go as planned. The sun hadn't even risen when I set out, feeling the weight of my rifle in my hands, the cool morning air biting at my skin. I was still in familiar territory, so I thought nothing of it when I ended up walking a bit further than usual. I'd never gotten lost out here before, and I figured I could always find my way back to camp. But after hours of walking and no sign of any game, I realized that something wasn't right. I stopped and looked around, the woods now feeling different, heavier, almost as if they were closing in on me. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank. I shook it, thinking it was just a glitch, but it remained dead. That's when I reached for my compass. It wasn't right either. My instincts told me it was off. I tried to stay calm. It was easy to panic in the woods, especially when things weren't going as they should. But I had to stay level-headed. I knew the general direction I needed to go, and I trusted my instincts. After all, I'd spent years in these woods. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest only seemed to stretch out further, more endless with each step I took. The trees were all starting to look the same, tall, gray, silent, and I couldn't tell if I was going in circles or making any progress at all. It was as if the woods were reshaping themselves, the paths I'd known fading away. I called out for the others, my hunting party, though I knew they were miles away. The silence swallowed my voice. Days passed. The food I'd brought with me was running low, and I hadn't been able to find anything worth hunting. I could feel the fatigue settling in, my legs growing weak with each step, my stomach gnawing with hunger. I kept moving, thinking that if I just kept walking, I'd find something familiar. But nothing seemed familiar anymore. It was when I realized that my compass was still wrong, off by several degrees, that a sinking feeling washed over me. The map in my pocket felt useless. The sun was low in the sky, and I could barely make out the landmarks I thought I knew. The trees were too thick, the terrain too unfamiliar. By the time I noticed I hadn't seen a sign of another person in days, I was starting to panic. The woods were vast, yes, but they were never this disorienting. Something was wrong. I could feel it now. Something was toying with me, leading me in circles. The sense of being followed grew stronger every day. The feeling that someone was watching me, just out of sight. My paranoia started to take hold. My exhaustion only made it worse, and each crack of a twig made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just lost. I was being led astray. I knew what it was like to be alone in the woods. I'd spent countless nights by myself, the only company being the sounds of the forest. But this was different. There was something off. The days stretched into a blur. I rationed what little food I had left, but the hunger gnawed at me, the constant ache in my gut. I couldn't remember the last time I had a full meal. I'd drink from streams to stay hydrated, but it wasn't enough. It was the exhaustion, the isolation, that started to eat away at my mind. The woods weren't a comforting place anymore. They were a maze, a trap, and I was the prey. Then, on the fourth day, I saw something. A shadow slipping between the trees just out of reach. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the shape was wrong. It was too tall, too human-like. But when I moved toward it, it was gone, vanishing into the thicket. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But my thoughts were scattered. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, hunger and fear warping my perception. Or maybe it was something else, something I couldn't understand. But whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. I had to get out. I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly through the woods, not with the days slipping by and my supplies running out. I took a deep breath and decided to move with purpose. I would head west. I couldn't remember why I thought that, but it felt right. I didn't know if it was the right direction, but it was the only direction I had left. I walked through the night, stumbling over roots, pushing past branches that seemed to slap at me in warning. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself stop. When I finally reached the ridge that overlooked the valley, I saw something that made my heart skip. Lights. Far off in the distance, faint and flickering in the darkness. My legs gave out beneath me, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe. It was a cabin, a light in the wilderness, a sign that I wasn't as far gone as I feared. With whatever energy I had left, I moved toward the lights, my steps slow and deliberate. The path was rocky, treacherous, but I didn't care. By morning, I stumbled into the clearing. A small, isolated cabin sat at the edge of the woods, the lights still burning in the windows. I knocked, but no one answered. I knocked again, harder, before turning the doorknob. Inside was empty, no sign of life, but there was a fire burning in the hearth, a pot of coffee sitting on the counter, and enough food to last me a week. I collapsed in the chair by the fire, my hands shaking, my mind still reeling from the past few days. I was safe. I was out of the woods, but something still gnawed at me. As I sat there, sipping the coffee, I couldn't help but wonder who left the cabin open, and more importantly, who had been watching me, leading me in circles through a maze that seemed designed to make me lose hope. That question lingered in my mind as the days passed, but one thing was clear. I had made it out, and whatever had happened in those woods, I had survived. I didn't expect much from the trip. To be honest, I just needed to get away from everything. After the divorce, everything felt like a blur. Just one thing after another piling up until I couldn't breathe. My name's Jack, and I'm 32. The last year of my life had been a train wreck, and I needed to clear my head. I didn't want anyone around. I didn't want to explain myself or hear any more pitying glances. So, I decided to go alone, camping in the woods by a small, remote lake. It was far enough from civilization to feel isolated, but not so far that I couldn't get help if something went wrong. I hadn't been camping in years, but that's exactly what I was looking for. Something simple, something that would help me get away from the noise in my head. I drove through winding country roads, the trees growing thicker as I approached the lake. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going, and honestly, I didn't plan on sharing much with anyone until I came back. The lake was in a forested area that wasn't marked on most maps, just a place locals knew about. That's what I liked about it. Quiet, untouched. Setting up camp wasn't hard. I pitched my tent, got a fire started, and then settled in with a can of beer and my thoughts. The sun was starting to set, and I felt the first stirrings of peace. I hadn't realized how much I missed being alone, without the pressure of a job or the mess of relationships. I let the stillness of the forest sink in, feeling its weight as the sky darkened around me. The first night wasn't bad. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, the wind rustled the branches overhead, and every now and then, an owl hooted somewhere in the distance. Felt nice, almost comforting. But as the night wore on, I began to hear something else. Twigs snapping in the underbrush. At first, I chalked it up to wildlife, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I wasn't exactly a seasoned camper, but I knew enough to recognize the sounds of animals moving through the forest. Still, it made me uneasy. The noises were close, closer than I expected. I tried to ignore it, but the rustling grew louder, more persistent. Something was moving around my camp. I held my breath and listened. It wasn't a big animal, I didn't think, but there was something off about it. The sounds didn't follow the usual rhythm of forest animals. They were too deliberate, too precise. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. My heart rate picked up, and I grabbed the flashlight by my side, my fingers trembling. I flashed it out the entrance of the tent, but there was nothing. The beam of light cut through the dark, but it only revealed shadows and the trees bending in the breeze. I waited, holding my breath, The sound stopped. For a moment, everything was still again. I told myself I was just imagining things. It's just the wilderness, I thought. I'm fine. I spent the rest of the night trying to sleep, but the eerie sensation of being watched lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I was here to get away, to clear my head, not to get paranoid over some animals. But when I went to start the fire, I noticed something strange. My fire starter, the one I'd left on the log by the fire pit, was gone. I didn't remember moving it. It was the kind of thing I'd remember, something small but useful. But it wasn't there anymore. I figured maybe I had misplaced it, or it had fallen somewhere without me noticing. I went about my morning routine, boiled some coffee, made a quick breakfast, and checked my gear. But the odd feeling lingered, and I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. As the day went on, the quietness of the forest began to feel oppressive. The wind had died down, and everything was eerily still. I went for a walk along the lake, hoping the open space would help clear my head, but the silence was overwhelming. It felt unnatural, like something was holding its breath, waiting. By the time the sun started to set again, I was already on edge. I tried to prepare myself for another restless night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I sat by the fire, I kept glancing into the darkness, expecting to see something moving between the trees. But nothing ever did. That night, the noises came again, closer this time. The crunch of twigs underfoot, the brush of leaves. I could hear something moving just outside my tent, circling it, methodical and slow. I froze, not daring to move. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't want to make a sound. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention to myself. It wasn't until the sound stopped, abruptly, that I let out a shaky breath. I sat there in the dark, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was just a curious animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, my tent was unzipped. I don't remember leaving it that way the night before. It was just slightly ajar, enough to make my stomach drop. I checked my gear again. This time, things were missing. A few small items. An extra pair of socks, a pack of matches, my knife, things I knew I hadn't moved. I thought about leaving then, packing up and heading home. But I was too stubborn. I didn't want to admit that I was scared. So I stayed, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. The next night, the sounds came back. This time, they were closer than ever. I could hear heavy breathing, like someone was just outside my tent, right there in the dark. I waited, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. It felt like the air around me was thick with tension, like something was closing in. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. I started packing up my things, but when I went to grab my backpack, it was gone. My gear had been moved again. Panic gripped me. I tore the camp apart, searching for my stuff, but it was all gone. My tent, my sleeping bag, my food, everything. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the area, but there was no sign of anything. No tracks, no trail. The forest was just as still as it had been before. My mind was racing. Someone was out there, someone who had been watching me, messing with me. I grabbed what little I had left and made my way toward the car. I didn't care if it was late or dark. I just needed to get out of that forest. But every step I took felt like someone was behind me, just out of sight. The trees seemed to close in, and I could hear the soft crunch of footsteps behind me, mimicking my own. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Finally, I reached my car and got in, slamming the door shut. I didn't even look back as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was far from the lake, the forest, and whatever or whoever had been stalking me. To this day, I still don't know who or what was out there. But I learned one thing. When you go looking for solitude, you might just find something else entirely. I've been planning this trip for months. As a writer, the idea of being away from distractions, surrounded only by trees, the sound of a river, and the rustling of leaves, seemed like the perfect environment to kickstart the creativity I'd been struggling to find lately. I was tired of the noise of the city, tired of the endless buzz of my phone, tired of the people and their constant demands. I wanted solitude, and that's exactly what this remote forest promised. I found the perfect spot, a forest in the highlands of Wyoming, far off the beaten path, known for its isolation. There was a small, quiet campsite near a river where I planned to spend a couple of days, but the real plan was to hike through the woods alone for the first few days, letting the silence of the forest become my only companion. I arrived in the area late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The road leading up to the forest had been gravel and winding, a long drive from the nearest town. I'd packed everything I thought I'd need: a small tent, sleeping bag, food supplies for a week, a journal, a few books, and my camera. I wasn't concerned about running out of supplies or getting lost. The forest was a well-trodden path for hikers, though I was alone this time as usual. I set up camp on the first night near the river, the water rushing gently beside me. The sounds of nature, birds calling, the wind through the trees were calming. The fire crackled beside me as I settled in, cooking my simple dinner and trying to relax. It was exactly the kind of peaceful setting I had imagined. I ate quietly, made some notes in my journal, and then climbed into my tent for the night. The soft hum of the forest outside became a lullaby, and soon I drifted off to sleep. But something woke me. The sound was subtle at first, a soft rustling, maybe a twig snapping. I thought it was the wind or some animal moving through the brush, but the sound was deliberate, almost methodical. I lay still, my mind racing, listening more intently. It was coming from the direction of my tent entrance, near the campfire. Someone, or something, was walking around my campsite. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but I didn't move. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. The forest was full of wildlife. It made sense, but the pacing of the footsteps felt too calculated, too slow, too purposeful to be an animal. I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The footsteps circled my tent, just outside the reach of the campfire's glow. Then they stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, straining my ears to hear anything that might give me some clue about who or what was out there. But it was silent again. The kind of silence that's heavy, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just the wind or a figment of my imagination. But the fear gnawed at me. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, trying not to make a sound, too afraid to even breathe loudly. Eventually, the quiet grew unbearable. Couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the dark canvas of the tent, listening for any other sounds. But there was nothing more.
No footsteps. No rustling.
The only sound was the river nearby. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just the natural noises of the forest playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. I had barely slept, tossing and turning all night. The forest was bathed in soft sunlight, the birds singing and the wind rustling through the trees. I tried to convince myself that the night's events were just a result of too much solitude, too much time to think. I got out of my tent, determined to get back to my hiking plans. I ate a quick breakfast of oatmeal, packed my things, and set out on the trail. The day was spent hiking through dense woods, trying to shake the feeling of unease that lingered from the previous night. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like eyes were on me, but I told myself it was just the forest. That night, I set up camp again, this time at a small clearing near the river. I made sure to place my tent far enough from the water's edge to avoid any flooding from a potential rainstorm, and I made a larger fire than usual. I told myself that this time I would get some sleep, but as the night wore on, that same unsettling feeling crept back. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart raced. I froze, barely breathing, listening intently. The footsteps weren't just outside my tent. They were closer this time, near the fire. I could hear the crunch of the dirt underfoot, the snap of twigs breaking. Whoever or whatever was out there was close. I waited for the sounds to fade, but they didn't. They kept circling. It felt as if someone was studying me, watching my every move from the shadows. I wanted to call out, to demand whoever it was leave me alone, but I couldn't make a sound. My mouth felt dry, my body tense. I knew I couldn't be sure of what was out there, and that fear gripped me even tighter. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I lay wide-eyed, staring at the dark canvas above me, waiting for the sounds to stop. When morning finally came, I was drained. My mind was racing. I didn't want to be afraid. I was supposed to be enjoying this solitude, finding peace, and instead, I was paralyzed by fear. I packed up my things again, trying to go about the day like I usually would. The forest was still beautiful. Its quiet beauty was undeniable. But now, every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig felt like a threat. I tried to focus on the landscape, taking photos and writing in my journal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching me. Every step I took felt wrong, as if I wasn't truly alone anymore. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew long, I returned to my campsite. I was relieved to find no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no broken twigs, nothing to suggest anyone had been here while I was gone. Maybe I was just imagining things. The forest was vast, and it could easily play tricks on your mind. Maybe I was just overly tired, too caught up in my own fears. I decided to stay another night, but as the night fell and the fire burned low, I began to hear it again, the soft, deliberate footsteps. They were even closer now, right outside my tent. I could hear them circling me, just like before. I didn't move this time, couldn't. My mind was spinning, my heart racing. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but I was too afraid to leave my tent. The footsteps didn't stop. They moved around slowly, methodically. I held my breath, praying they would go away. By morning, the footsteps had stopped. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to stay a moment longer. The forest felt suffocating now, the peace shattered by the strange, relentless feeling that someone was out there watching me. As I walked back to my car, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I was leaving. The forest, with its silence and solitude, had become a place of dread, not inspiration. A few days later, I returned home, safe but shaken. I kept thinking about that forest, about the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, that I had just let my imagination run wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind. Something had been out there, circling my tent, following me through the trees. And the feeling never left me, not completely. Every time I stepped into the woods again, I felt the weight of those footsteps following me. It was supposed to be an adventure, a group of friends, a weekend camping trip, and a chance to bond in the middle of nowhere. I was 23, determined to prove I could lead a group of people into the wild. The fact that this was my first camping trip didn't bother me. I had done all my research. I knew how to set up a tent, start a fire, and identify poisonous plants. In theory, I was more than prepared. But the truth was, none of us had any real experience. My friends were excited but equally clueless. There was Marcus, 24, the quiet one who never spoke much but always showed up for anything. Then there was Beth, 22, the sporty one, always up for a challenge. And finally, we had Matt, 23, the jokester. All of them trusted me to plan the trip, to lead the way. They had no idea how much I was winging it. We were heading to a forest near Lake Lehman, a spot I had read about online. It wasn't too far from the city, but far enough to feel like we were escaping into nature. The forest was supposed to be peaceful, with a river running through it, perfect for a weekend getaway. The idea of camping by the water's edge seemed great. The sound of the flowing river at night was supposed to be calming, something I thought would help us unwind. We rented a van, packed our gear, and set off. The first sign that things might not go as planned came when we arrived. The forest was dense, darker than I expected, even though it was still late afternoon. The trees towered over us, their thick canopies blocking out much of the sun. We had to park the van by the side of a small dirt road and hike a bit to find a good spot near the river. The walk wasn't long, but it felt more isolated than I anticipated. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet, the distant call of birds, the rustling of something large moving through the trees. Perfect, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling that the place was already too quiet. We reached the river. It was a beautiful sight, the water glistening under the fading sunlight, its flow gentle yet constant. It seemed like the perfect place to set up camp. But that's where the real trouble began. First, setting up the tents was harder than I had imagined. The ground was uneven, and no matter how hard we tried, the stakes wouldn't stay in place. I had brought a small tent for myself and a larger one for the group. I had assumed it would be a simple task, but after an hour of struggling with the poles, we realized the tent wasn't even the right size for all of us. Beth tried to help, but she was just as frustrated as I was. "You sure you read the instructions right?" she asked, eyeing the pile of mismatched tent parts. Yeah, I said, trying to keep my cool. But inside, I felt the first stirrings of panic. I had overestimated how easy it would be. I'd read all the blogs, watched all the videos, but it was different in person. Nothing went as smoothly as I had expected. We were in the middle of our third attempt to set up the tent when Marcus tripped over a rock and twisted his ankle. It wasn't a major injury, but it slowed things down significantly. He sat down by the river, nursing his ankle, while I tried to finish setting up the tents. "I think I'll just sit here," Marcus said, his voice strained. "Let me know if you need anything." After another hour of effort, we finally managed to get everything set up. But the delay had already put us behind schedule. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. We decided to start a fire. The wood we gathered was damp, and it took much longer than I expected to get it going. By the time we had a decent fire, it was already dark. We ate canned beans and hot dogs, not exactly gourmet, but enough to keep us going. I was starting to realize how unprepared I actually was for this trip. The river's sound was louder now, more constant in the silence of the night. It should have been comforting, but it felt oppressive. The night was colder than we anticipated, and none of us had packed enough warm clothing. We huddled around the fire, trying to stay warm, but as the darkness deepened, an unsettling feeling settled in. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. There was nothing to fear, but the forest had an eerie quietness about it. Every now and then, I would hear something snap in the distance, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. We all decided to go to bed early. The plan was to get a good night's rest and figure out a hike for the next day. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind raced with every strange sound. At some point, I must have drifted off because when I woke up, the fire had burned down to nothing but embers, and the moon was high in the sky. That's when I noticed it. Marcus was missing. I don't know how long he had been gone, but I was wide awake now. I called out for him, but there was no answer. My heart started to race. I woke up the others, and together we searched the area, calling his name. There was no sign of him, not even footprints in the soft earth by the river. I tried to stay calm, thinking he might have gone for a walk, but then I noticed something strange. By the riverbank, near the trees, there was a large, dark patch on the ground. I walked closer. It was a set of bloody handprints, smeared across the dirt, like someone had tried to crawl their way through the mud. Panic set in. What had happened? Where was Marcus? We searched for hours, but it was as if he had disappeared into thin air. The river was still there, the trees still stood tall, but there was no sign of him. By the time the sun started to rise, we were all exhausted, on edge, and terrified. We hadn't found any more clues, but the silence of the forest felt suffocating. Every rustle in the bushes made us jump. We knew we had to leave, but there was still the problem of getting out. Our map, the one I had carefully studied before the trip, didn't match the terrain at all. The paths were all wrong, and we couldn't find our way back to the van. As we wandered through the forest, trying to make sense of it all, we stumbled upon something else. Marcus's backpack. It was hanging from a tree branch, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Inside, we found his phone, still unlocked. But when we tried to call for help, the signal was dead. It wasn't just the map that didn't match. It felt like the forest itself had changed. The trees seemed to twist in unnatural directions, the ground shifting beneath our feet as if the landscape was playing tricks on us. Every step we took led us deeper into a maze we couldn't escape from. We knew then something was watching us, guiding us, or maybe just toying with us. We decided to make one last push to find our way out. The hours dragged on. The forest seemed endless. I don't know how long we were out there, but eventually, we found our way back to the road. It was late afternoon again, and the van was just where we left it. We didn't say much as we piled into the van and drove away. We were shaken, exhausted, and confused. Marcus was gone, and none of us knew what had happened to him. We never spoke about it again. The trip wasn't what I'd expected. I thought I could prove myself, but instead, I learned the harsh reality of what happens when you try to play a game you're not prepared for. As I sit here now, years later, I still don't know what happened that night. All I know is that something in that forest was waiting for us, and it's a mistake I'll never make again. We were 4 friends, college roommates, deciding to take one last trip together before everyone scattered to start our separate lives. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a peaceful break from the grind of post-graduation chaos. We chose a remote national park in the mountains of Idaho, known for its rugged beauty and difficult hiking trails. It was the kind of place where you could easily get lost if you weren't careful, but we didn't think much of it. We were young, healthy, and invincible, at least that's how we felt. The plan was simple. We'd take the weekend to hike through the dense forest, camp under the stars, and talk about life after school. We rented a cabin near one of the main trailheads, a place far enough from civilization to make the experience feel remote, but still close enough to make it easy to get help in an emergency. It was early September, and the weather was perfect, cool, dry air with a slight breeze. It was me, my 3 friends, Chris, a guy I'd known since freshman year, Sarah, who always kept everyone laughing, and Jake, the adventurous one who was always the first to suggest we do something risky. Jake was the one who convinced us to take a shortcut through the woods. He'd been to this park once before on a solo trip, and he thought he knew a faster route. The main trail had a massive loop around the park that would have taken us a few hours, but Jake was convinced we could cut through the forest and save time. "Come on, we're not idiots," Jake said as we stood at the edge of the trail, looking at the dense forest that stretched out in front of us. "I've done this before. We'll be fine. Trust me." We hesitated, but the excitement of doing something a little off the beaten path got the best of us. "All right, let's do it," I said, trying to match Jake's confidence. We turned off the main trail and plunged into the forest, immediately leaving the comfort of the marked paths. The air was thicker here, cooler under the canopy of trees, and the sound of birds and rustling leaves seemed to block out all other noise. It felt peaceful at first, almost like we were alone in the world, but that serenity quickly started to shift. The trees were closer together here, and the ground was uneven. Roots twisted up from the earth, and thorny bushes clawed at our legs. Still, we pushed on, thinking the worst was behind us. As the hours passed, the forest grew denser. The path Jake had promised would be clear was anything but. We stopped frequently to catch our breath, trying to keep our spirits high. But as we ventured deeper, the sunlight began to fade, and the air grew heavier. The trees were no longer spaced out. They pressed in on us from every side, making the forest feel like a maze with no exit. Our chatter faded, and we were all too focused on keeping our footing to speak much. Jake was leading, his steps confident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It felt like the forest was closing in around us. By the time the sun began to set, we realized we hadn't seen a familiar landmark for hours. The trail was nowhere to be found. Our phones were useless, no signal at all. We were lost. We tried to retrace our steps, but every direction seemed the same. The dense trees blurred everything together, and soon we weren't even sure which way we'd come from. We were out of water, and the small amount of food we'd brought with us was nearly gone. "Great," Sarah muttered, her voice shaking. This was supposed to be a fun trip, not this. Jake seemed unfazed. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice oddly calm. "Let's just keep going." But as the night fell, things only got worse. The temperature dropped sharply, and we could see our breath in the air. None of us were prepared for a night out in the woods, especially without proper gear. We found a small clearing and set up camp as best we could. We had no tents, so we huddled under a few tarps we managed to pull from our bags. The darkness was thick around us, and every small sound sent us into a state of alert. I kept hearing things, branches cracking, leaves rustling, but whenever I looked, I couldn't see anything. The wind picked up, and the sound of it in the trees made everything feel more isolating. I tried to sleep, but my mind raced, replaying the events over and over. How had we gotten here? Why hadn't we turned back when we had the chance? Around midnight, something strange started to happen. Jake, who had been the most confident among us, began acting differently. He kept checking the map, even though we all knew it was useless now. He didn't seem to want to talk, and when we asked him what the plan was, he just shrugged and said, "We'll find our way out. I know the way." But his eyes didn't match his words. There was something off about them. His hands were trembling slightly, and I noticed he kept glancing around like he was waiting for something or someone. "Jake, what's going on?" I asked, feeling a chill settle in my bones. He didn't answer. Instead, he started packing up some of our food in a way that seemed deliberate. It was like he was hiding it, keeping it for himself. My stomach turned as I watched him. We didn't have enough food to spare, and yet he was stashing it away. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Jake, what are you doing with that? We need it." He looked up at me, his eyes almost vacant. "We'll need it later. Trust me." The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. We were too tired, too scared to argue. We stayed up in shifts keeping watch, but it was hard to tell what was real anymore. Every snap of a twig, every sound of wind made me think something was out there, something watching us. By morning, Jake's behavior had grown worse. He barely spoke to us, and when he did, his words were strange, disjointed. as if he was trying to make plans that didn't make sense. We tried to reason with him, but he didn't listen. We were all losing our patience, but more than that, we were losing our grip on reality. The forest was disorienting, and the sense of isolation was starting to take its toll. We couldn't even tell if we were still on the same path. It felt like we were walking in circles, like the woods were closing in on us. I kept hearing whispers. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound of soft voices seemed to echo in the distance. It felt like the forest itself was alive, like it was trying to communicate with us. Every time we stopped to listen, the whispers stopped. We pressed on, desperate to find our way back. But every step seemed to take us deeper into the woods. We were out of options. That's when Jake finally admitted what had been bothering him the entire time. He had taken a wrong turn earlier before we had started the shortcut, and instead of admitting it, he had kept pushing us further off course. He didn't want to admit he was lost, so he had kept us moving in the wrong direction for hours. I could see the fear in his eyes now. We were all scared. We had no choice but to keep going, hoping that somehow we would find the trail again. We had to trust each other, even if we didn't trust Jake anymore. In the end, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled onto a ranger station. A couple of rangers were there, and we had never been so relieved to see anyone in our lives. They helped us out of the woods, gave us food and water, and made sure we were okay. Jake, though, didn't seem relieved at all. He kept his head down, avoiding our eyes. It wasn't until we were back in civilization that we realized just how dangerous the whole situation had been. We could have easily gotten hurt or worse. We had been lucky, but Jake's confidence had nearly cost us everything. That weekend was supposed to be a trip to reconnect, but instead, it was a reminder of how easily things could go wrong when you think you're invincible. We all learned something that day about the importance of sticking together, admitting when you're lost, and knowing when to turn back. We never spoke about that trip again, and after that, we didn't really stay in touch. Maybe it was because we knew we would never forget the way we had nearly lost everything in those woods. Or maybe it was because we knew we'd all changed in some way, and there was no going back from it. I had been thinking about getting out of the city for years. The noise, the crowds, the constant rush. It all started to wear me down. So, when I came across a listing for a cabin in the woods, tucked away in a remote part of Maine, I jumped on the opportunity. The price was surprisingly low, and the agent told me it had been sitting on the market for years. I didn't think much of it at the time. To me, it felt like a steal. The cabin was small, just one floor with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a main living space. It was old, built sometime in the 1960s, and hadn't been updated since. The previous owner had died, and apparently no one in the family wanted it. It needed work, but that was part of the appeal. I had always dreamed of fixing up a place, turning it into something my own. Plus, it had potential as a future rental property. The day I drove out to the cabin, it was late spring. The trees were lush and green, and the gravel road leading to the property was lined with dense forest. I felt a sense of excitement as I pulled up to the driveway. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered from the photos. Weathered wood siding, a sagging porch, and an overgrown yard. I parked my truck and started unloading. I had brought everything I thought I'd need for the weekend. Tools, cleaning supplies, a sleeping bag, and enough food and water to last me a few days. My plan was to clean up the place, take stock of what needed fixing, and maybe start on some small projects. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. Stale and musty, like the place hadn't been aired out in years. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked through each room. It was exactly what I expected, but I wasn't deterred. This was my project, and I was ready to get started. I spent the rest of the day cleaning. I swept the floors, wiped down the counters, and threw out what little furniture had been left behind. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted but satisfied with my progress. The place still needed a lot of work, but at least it felt somewhat livable now. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag in the living room, I heard the forest come alive with sound. Crickets chirped, owls hooted, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me just how far I was from civilization. It was peaceful at first, but as the hours passed, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel driveway. I sat up, straining to hear, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it started. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I chalked up my nerves to being in an unfamiliar place. I spent the day working on repairs, fixing loose floorboards, and patching up holes in the walls. It felt good to be productive, but there was a strange tension I couldn't shake. Around midday, I went outside to get some fresh air and noticed something odd. The tools I had left on the porch were no longer where I had placed them. My hammer and screwdriver were on the ground near the steps, and my tape measure was halfway down the driveway. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. Had I dropped them without realizing it? I didn't remember being that careless. The rest of the day passed without incident, but that night, the unease returned. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard a faint rustling outside the window. It was subtle, like someone or something was moving through the bushes. I stayed perfectly still, listening, but the sound faded after a few minutes. The following morning, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I walked around the property, looking for any signs that someone had been there. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but near the edge of the woods, I found footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. The prints were larger than my boots, and they looked fresh. My stomach tightened as I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Someone had been on the property, and they weren't trying to hide it. I went back inside and locked the door, something I hadn't thought to do before. I spent the rest of the day working indoors, but my focus was shot. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone watching me. That night was the worst yet. Around midnight, I was woken by the sound of something banging against the side of the cabin. It was loud and rhythmic, like someone was hitting the wall with a stick. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Shining the beam outside, I couldn't see anything. The banging stopped as soon as I moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I decided to leave. I told myself it was just for a few days, that I needed a break, but deep down, I knew I was running. Something wasn't right about the cabin, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Before I left, I decided to do some research on the property. I went to the local library and asked about the history of the area. An older librarian hesitated before pulling out a few old newspapers and documents. The cabin, it turned out, had a dark past. The previous owner, a man named Frank Carter, had lived there alone for decades. In the 1990s, he disappeared without a trace. No one ever found out what happened to him. The family had left the cabin untouched until they decided to sell it. I couldn't stop thinking about Frank. What had happened to him? And was it connected to what I was experiencing? I returned to the cabin a week later, determined to get answers. But as I approached the property, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. The front door was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the tire iron from my truck and cautiously stepped inside. The living room was exactly as I had left it, but there was something new on the floor. A single muddy footprint, larger than any I'd seen before. That was the last straw. I turned and walked out, locking the door behind me. I put the cabin up for sale the next day. I still don't know who or what was in the woods that weekend. Part of me doesn't want to know. All I know is that the cabin wasn't the escape I had hoped for. It was a warning, and I listened. I'm Claire, a 34-year-old wildlife tracker and nature researcher. For as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by the patterns animals leave behind. Tiny clues that reveal their movements, behaviors, and lives. That fascination turned into a career, one that often takes me to remote, untouched places. This time, I planned a week-long solo trip to a cabin deep in the northern Minnesota woods. The cabin was more of a rustic shack, really, just one room with a small wood stove, a cot, and a tiny table for my gear. No running water, no electricity. Perfect for my needs. The idea was to document the habits of local wildlife, especially the deer, foxes, and wolves that moved through the area. I arrived in early October, when the air had that crisp, clean bite that hints at the coming winter. The forest stretched out endlessly around me, a mix of pines and hardwoods. I parked my truck at a small trailhead about a mile away and carried my gear to the cabin. By the time I settled in, the sun was low, painting the trees in gold and orange. The first few days were peaceful. I spent hours tracking animal prints, setting up motion-activated cameras, and jotting down notes in my field journal. The forest was alive with movement. Squirrels darting through the underbrush, deer cautiously stepping through the trees, and the occasional howl of a distant wolf pack. It was the solitude I craved, with nothing but nature to occupy my thoughts. But then things started to feel off. It began on the fourth day. I was following a trail of deer tracks early in the morning when I noticed something strange. The deer prints were interrupted by another set of tracks, larger, heavier, and human. The footprints weren't from hiking boots or sneakers. They looked like old work boots, worn and uneven, and they seemed to follow the deer trail before veering off into the trees. I told myself it was probably a hunter. The area was remote, but not entirely off-limits to people. Maybe someone else was out here hunting illegally before the season opened. It was unusual, but not impossible. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept up my spine as I stared at those prints. That night, I heard something outside the cabin. It started as faint rustling, like an animal moving through the underbrush. Then, there was a distinct snap, the sound of a twig breaking. I sat up in my cot, every muscle in my body tense. I reached for my flashlight and shone it through the window, but all I saw were the dark shapes of trees and the empty clearing around the cabin. The next morning, I checked the area around the cabin. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the usual scatter of animal tracks near the edge of the woods. But as I circled the cabin, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, the same uneven boot prints I had seen on the deer trail. They led right up to the cabin door before circling around the side and disappearing into the woods. Whoever had been out there last night had come within feet of where I was sleeping. I felt a chill settle over me. I wasn't alone out here, and whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. I spent the day trying to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to those prints. I started to notice other strange signs. Branches broken at odd angles, as if someone had deliberately snapped them, and small patches of disturbed earth that looked like they'd been dug up recently. Then I found the traps. They were crude but effective. Sharp metal jaws attached to heavy chains, hidden beneath leaves and dirt. I nearly stepped on one, catching sight of it just in time. It wasn't the kind of trap used for small game or fur animals. It was bigger, meant for something larger. My breath caught as I realized what this meant. Someone was setting these traps near the cabin, and they weren't just for wildlife. By the sixth day, the unease had turned into full-blown fear. I barely slept at night, every noise outside sending my heart racing. I started carrying my hunting knife and bear spray with me, even inside the cabin. That evening, I found fresh tracks leading directly to the cabin again. But this time, they didn't stop at the door. They circled back into the woods. I decided to follow them, desperate to understand what was going on. The tracks led me to a small clearing about half a mile from the cabin. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I spotted it. A pile of bones, some picked clean, others still bearing scraps of flesh. Nearby was an old fire pit, the ashes cold but recently used. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone was using this area as a hunting ground, not for animals but for something darker. I didn't know if they were stalking humans or setting traps indiscriminately, but I knew I couldn't stay. I rushed back to the cabin, my heart pounding. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my backpack. The sun was setting, and I didn't want to be out there after dark. As I stepped outside, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. I started down the trail toward my truck, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. About halfway to the trailhead, I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves behind me. I froze, my hand tightening around the bear spray. Slowly, I turned, but I didn't see anything. I kept moving, my senses on high alert. The crunching came again, closer this time. Whoever was following me wasn't bothering to hide their presence anymore. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I adjusted my grip on the spray and broke into a jog, the weight of my pack slowing me down. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, every shadow in the trees looking like a threat. Finally, I saw it, the glint of my truck's windshield through the trees. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Just as I stepped into the clearing, I heard a low, guttural laugh from somewhere behind me. I didn't look back. I sprinted to the truck, threw my pack into the passenger seat, and started the engine. The tires spun for a moment in the loose dirt before gripping, and I tore down the gravel road, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I reported everything to the local authorities, but I never found out who or what was out there. The traps, the footprints, the pile of bones, it was all too real. That week in the woods taught me something I'll never forget. Nature isn't always the scariest thing out there. Sometimes it's the people who hide within it. I'm Kevin, a guy who spent years hiking through the dense woods of northern Vermont, always finding some sense of peace by getting lost in nature. The stress from my job had been building for months, and I was craving a break. No emails, no calls, no distractions. Just a few days alone to clear my mind. I decided to take a solo trip to a cabin I'd visited once before, deep in the mountains. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, and I figured it would be the perfect spot to reset. The journey to the cabin was familiar, though it felt different this time. The air was colder than usual, and the deeper I hiked, the quieter the forest seemed. I couldn't even hear the usual rustle of small animals or the wind moving through the trees. The silence pressed down on me, as if the woods were holding their breath. It was the kind of eerie stillness that made you feel like you weren't entirely alone, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the solitude making my mind wander. When I finally reached the cabin, I noticed right away that something was off. The place looked more run down than I remembered. The wooden walls were darker, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of years of neglect. The path leading up to the door was overgrown with weeds, and the door creaked when I pushed it open, as if it hadn't been touched in ages. Still, it was a roof over my head, and I had planned to spend at least the next few nights there, so I wasn't going to let the state of the cabin deter me. I moved inside, setting down my pack and glancing around. The furniture, which I remembered being sparse but comfortable, was now covered in dust and cobwebs. The small fireplace in the corner had a pile of half-burned logs, and the windows were fogged over with age. I opened them, letting in the crisp mountain air, hoping it would freshen the place up a bit. I set about cleaning up the best I could, sweeping out the dust and organizing things in a way that felt more inviting. The whole time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't like hearing footsteps or seeing a shadow, just an overwhelming sense that someone or something was out there paying attention to me. Every time I turned my back, I felt eyes on the back of my neck, but when I checked, nothing was there. It made my skin crawl. That night, I tried to settle in. I built a fire in the old fireplace, cracked open a beer, and pulled out my map to plan my hiking route for the next day. But the quiet was suffocating. The night dragged on, and I kept hearing noises outside, branches cracking, the faintest rustle of leaves, but nothing that would explain the feeling of someone being out there, watching. Around midnight, I heard a sound that froze me in my tracks. A low whistle, soft but unmistakable, from somewhere just beyond the trees. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. Whoever or whatever had made that sound knew the woods far too well. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and headed out onto the porch. The beam cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows. I scanned the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of life. The whistle had stopped as suddenly as it started. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but the forest was still, too still. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to get some answers. I packed my gear and set out on one of my usual hiking trails, but something felt off. The trail I remembered didn't look the same. There were patches of disturbed earth where there shouldn't have been, and tree limbs that seemed broken in unnatural ways. I paused, examining the ground, and found tracks, footprints to be exact. But they didn't look like any footprints I'd seen before. They were deeper, as if the person who had made them was heavy or wearing boots far larger than mine. I thought maybe someone else was hiking the same area, but the prints led off the path into the dense underbrush, vanishing into the trees. I couldn't tell if the tracks were fresh or old, and I felt a shiver of unease crawl up my spine. I'd never seen any other hikers out here before, so the idea that someone else was in the area made me feel trapped, as if I had wandered into someone else's territory. I spent the next couple of days trying to keep myself busy. I hiked, explored, and kept to the cabin at night, but every time I stepped outside, the sense of being followed grew stronger. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone was out there. The feeling was too overwhelming to ignore. Sometimes I'd hear a faint rustling behind me, just out of sight, but when I turned, there was nothing there. By the third day, I'd had enough. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things and set out on what should have been a familiar route. But when I tried to retrace my steps, I couldn't. The trail had changed. It was as if the path I'd hiked in on had been deliberately altered. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by strange configurations of trees, rocks, and brush. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I couldn't have gotten lost this easily. But the more I walked, the more I realized I was heading in circles. The tracks I'd followed earlier seemed to have disappeared entirely. I retraced my steps in the opposite direction, but the more I tried to find my way back to the cabin, the more lost I felt. Panic crept in as the forest seemed to close in around me. The woods, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a maze designed to trap me. Hours passed, and the sunlight began to fade, casting long shadows across the trees. I knew I needed to find shelter before dark, but the trees all looked the same. My mind was racing, and I started to question everything. The tracks I'd seen, the strange feeling of being watched. Had someone been leading me off the trail on purpose? Or was it all just in my head? Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. A small clearing, and in the center, a pile of rocks stacked in a strange, almost ritualistic pattern. It was nothing I'd ever seen before, and it made no sense in the middle of the woods. But there was something about it that seemed intentional, as if someone had been there recently and they were watching me now. I couldn't stay here. I turned back, heading in the opposite direction. Every step felt like I was being followed, but I couldn't hear anything. Just the beating of my own heart, louder than ever. The cabin was no longer an option. It was too far, and the more I tried to find my way back, the more the woods seemed to conspire against me. By nightfall, I was exhausted and scared out of my mind. I took refuge in a small cave I found, huddling inside with nothing but my flashlight and a dwindling sense of hope. I spent the night there, terrified that whatever had been watching me was getting closer. When morning finally came, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the cave. I knew it was time to face whatever was out there. There was no running anymore. It was late September when Mia and Jack decided to take a weekend away from the chaos of city life. We were both in our late 30s and lived in Geneva, Switzerland. The idea of staying in a remote cabin nestled in the Jura Mountains seemed perfect. Just us, the woods, and silence. Jack found the place on a rental site. The photos showed a charming wooden cabin surrounded by trees, with a small creek nearby. It looked cozy and inviting. We booked it without much thought. The drive there was picturesque. Rolling hills, dense forests, and quaint villages passed by as we followed the winding roads. The air was cool. The leaves had started turning golden, and everything felt calm. The directions took us off the main road onto a narrow gravel path that wound deeper into the woods. I remember glancing at Jack when the road seemed to go on forever, but he assured me we were close. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked even better in person. It was small, with a sloping roof and a wraparound porch. The trees around it were tall and close, giving the place an isolated feel. There was no cell service, which made me a little uneasy, but Jack seemed thrilled. He always loved the idea of unplugging completely. We spent the first day settling in, unpacking groceries, and exploring the area. There was a fire pit outside, and Jack made plans to roast marshmallows that evening. The inside of the cabin was rustic but comfortable. There was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom with a large window overlooking the woods. Everything felt perfect. The first night was uneventful. We sat by the fire pit, talking about work and life, the stars above us brighter than I had seen in years. The woods were eerily quiet at night, with only the occasional rustle of leaves. When we went to bed, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the stillness. The second night was when things started to feel off. We had spent the day hiking and returned to the cabin exhausted. After dinner, we played cards by the fire before heading to bed. I was half asleep when I heard it, a soft but deliberate knock at the front door. It was so faint at first that I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, 3 distinct knocks. I nudged Jack awake, my heart racing. He groggily got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went to check. I stayed in bed, listening intently. When he opened the door, the hinges creaked loudly, and cold air rushed into the cabin. He called out into the night, but there was no response. After a moment, he shut the door and shrugged it off. "Probably an animal," he said, climbing back into bed. I tried to agree, but something about it felt wrong. Animals don't knock. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Jack dismissed my concerns, teasing me for being jumpy. But I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows, as if he wasn't entirely convinced either. We decided to take another hike to clear our minds. The trails around the cabin were beautiful, but the dense trees felt suffocating. I kept hearing twigs snapping behind us, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. When we got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The bag of snacks we'd left on the counter was missing. I asked Jack if he'd moved it, but he hadn't. We searched the cabin, thinking we might have misplaced it, but it was gone. Jack joked that maybe a bear had gotten in, but the windows and doors were all locked. There was no sign of forced entry. That night, the knocking came again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. Jack opened the door immediately, flashlight in hand, but again, there was no one there. He walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter, while I stayed inside, my stomach in knots. When he came back, he looked shaken. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was starting to feel uneasy too. Over the next 2 days, the knocking continued every night. Each time, it grew louder and more persistent. Jack started keeping a fire poker by the door, and we double-checked the locks on all the windows and doors before bed. But it wasn't just the knocking. Other strange things began happening. Items in the cabin would be moved when we weren't looking. My coat, which I'd left hanging by the door, was found draped over a chair in the living room. The coffee mug Jack had left on the kitchen counter was suddenly on the floor, shattered. At first, we thought we were just being careless, but it became clear that someone or something was coming into the cabin while we weren't watching. The final straw came when we woke up one morning to find the word "leave" scrawled on the outside of the cabin's front door in what looked like mud. My stomach dropped. Jack tried to stay calm, saying it was probably some local kids playing a prank, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We decided to pack up and leave immediately. When we tried to leave, we discovered the gravel road leading out of the woods had been blocked. A large tree had been felled across the path, and there was no way around it. Jack tried using his phone, but there was still no service. The realization hit us hard. We were trapped. We spent the next few hours trying to come up with a plan. Jack wanted to hike back to the nearest road to get help, but it was miles away, and neither of us felt safe splitting up. We decided to wait until morning, hoping whoever was tormenting us would leave us alone. That night was the worst. The knocking didn't stop this time. It started as soon as the sun went down and continued for hours. It moved from the front door to the windows, then to the back door. We sat in the living room, clutching the fire poker and a kitchen knife, jumping at every sound. I barely slept, my ears straining for any sign of movement. At dawn, we decided we couldn't wait any longer. Jack grabbed the hatchet from the cabin's woodpile, and we started walking. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain we were being watched. When we reached the blocked road, Jack started hacking at the tree with the hatchet. It was slow, grueling work. I stood guard, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. After what felt like hours, we managed to create a small gap big enough to drive through. We didn't waste any time. Jack gunned the engine, and we sped down the gravel road, branches scraping against the car. When we finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief so overwhelming I started crying. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away. We reported the incident to the rental site and the local authorities, but nothing came of it. The owner of the cabin claimed he had no idea what had happened and hadn't had any similar complaints. Jack and I never found out who or what was behind the harassment. But one thing was clear. Whoever it was, they wanted us gone. It's been months now, but I still think about that weekend. The sound of knocking haunts me, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. One thing is certain. I'll never set foot in a remote cabin again. It was late October 2022, when the four of us, me, Josh, Nate, and Chloe, piled into Josh's beat-up SUV and headed for a cabin in the Adirondacks. The drive up was full of chatter and music, the kind of excitement that came from escaping college stress and midterms. Josh had found the place on some rental site. It wasn't exactly luxurious, but it had charm. A weathered log exterior, a stone fireplace, and a view of the woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. The cabin was about as secluded as you could get. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, and the last mile of the road was unpaved and bumpy. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and barely any electricity, just a generator that powered the essentials. Josh thought it was perfect. He'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, but I could tell he wasn't thrilled about Nate coming along. The tension wasn't new. Nate had started dating Chloe a few months ago, and everyone knew it wasn't just awkward for Josh. It was infuriating. He dated Chloe for 2 years before they broke up, and while he never said anything outright, the way his jaw tightened whenever Nate touched her said it all. I didn't think this trip was a good idea, but Josh insisted it would be fine. We're all adults, he'd said. Maybe, but barely. When we arrived, the sun was setting, casting the woods in a soft orange glow. The cabin creaked as we unloaded our bags and groceries. Inside, it smelled like wood and dust, but it was cozy. There was a small kitchen, a cramped living room with a lumpy couch and 2 bedrooms. Josh and I took one. Nate and Chloe took the other. The first night was uneventful. We made pasta, played cards, and drank cheap beer. By the time we turned in, it felt like the trip might actually go smoothly. By the second day, the cracks started to show. It began with little things. Chloe insisting Nate help with breakfast, which he didn't, or Josh snapping at me when I spilled coffee on the counter. It was as if the cabin was amplifying every annoyance. Then there was the firewood. Josh had told us to gather some for the fireplace before dark, but Nate brushed him off, saying he'd do it later. When later came, Nate was still on the couch, scrolling through his phone. Josh ended up going out alone, grumbling under his breath. I tried to mediate, but Josh was fuming. Dinner wasn't any better. Chloe cooked, but Josh criticized the food, and Chloe snapped back. Nate, of course, took her side, and soon they were shouting at each other. I just sat there, poking at my plate, wishing I were anywhere else. On the third night, the storm hit. Rain pounded the roof and wind howled through the trees. We stayed inside, trying to make the best of it. Nate suggested we play a drinking game, but Josh shut him down. "I'm not in the mood," he muttered, retreating to the couch. Around midnight, Chloe gasped. She'd been looking for her phone but found it on the counter. Its screen lit up with a strange message. "You shouldn't have come here." We all laughed it off at first, assuming it was a prank. But then Nate checked his phone. Same message. So did Josh. Mine was the only phone without it, which made me feel uneasy. Maybe it was just a glitch, I told myself, but the mood in the room shifted. We triple-checked the doors and windows before going to bed. When we woke up, the cabin was a mess. Furniture was overturned, the fridge door was wide open, and food was scattered everywhere. Josh blamed Nate, claiming it was his way of getting back at him. Nate denied it, saying he was asleep all night. Chloe sided with Nate, of course, which only made Josh angrier. I tried to calm everyone down, but it felt like the walls were closing in. That evening, Nate went out to get some air and never came back. At first, we thought he was sulking and would return when he cooled off. But as the hours passed, worry set in. Chloe was frantic, pacing the cabin and yelling his name into the dark woods. Josh was less concerned. "He probably just wanted attention," he muttered, but even he looked uneasy. We decided to search for him. Armed with flashlights, we split up, Chloe and me in one direction, Josh in another. The woods were eerily silent except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. I could feel Chloe's fear radiating off her, but she didn't say much. We didn't find anything, not even footprints, and eventually we gave up and headed back. Josh wasn't there when we returned. Chloe panicked, thinking something had happened to him too. I tried to reassure her, but the truth was, I was scared. Something was wrong and I didn't know what. Hours later, Josh stumbled back into the cabin, disheveled and bleeding from a gash on his arm. He said he'd gotten lost and fell, but something about his story didn't add up. His flashlight was missing, and his clothes were muddy, as if he'd been crawling through the dirt. Chloe demanded to know if he'd seen Nate, but Josh just shook his head, avoiding her eyes. That night, I didn't sleep. The generator sputtered out around midnight, plunging the cabin into darkness. I lay there, listening to the wind and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Every sound made my heart race. In the morning, Chloe's phone was missing, and Nate's bag was gone. Josh swore he hadn't touched them, but Chloe didn't believe him. Neither did I. It was Chloe who found the notebook. It was hidden under one of the couch cushions, filled with pages of scribbled notes. Most of it didn't make sense. Fragments of thoughts, random drawings, but one line stood out. They don't trust me. I have to do it first. Josh claimed he didn't know where the notebook came from, but Chloe was convinced it was his. She accused him of setting everything up, of trying to scare Nate away or worse. Josh denied it, but his protests felt hollow. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. He'd been so angry, so bitter. Maybe he'd snapped. We decided to leave. Chloe refused to stay another night, and honestly, I didn't want to either. But when we tried to start the car, it wouldn't budge. The tires were slashed. Josh blamed Nate, claiming he must have done it before disappearing, but Chloe wasn't buying it. "It was you," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You wanted him gone." Josh snapped, yelling that she didn't know what she was talking about. The argument escalated until Josh shoved Chloe against the car. That's when I stepped in, pulling him back. "What's wrong with you?" I shouted, but he didn't answer. He just stormed off into the woods, leaving us behind. We waited for hours, but Josh never came back. By the time night fell, we were out of options. Chloe and I barricaded ourselves in the cabin, hoping to make it through the night. In the morning, we walked to town. Took hours, but we made it. When we told the police what had happened, they searched the cabin and the surrounding woods. They found Nate's body a few miles away, hidden under a pile of leaves. He'd been dead for days. Josh was never found. Some say he ran, unable to face what he'd done. Others think he's still out there, hiding in the woods. I don't know what to believe, but I do know this: I'll never set foot in a cabin again. I hadn't spoken to my younger brother, Matt, in almost 5 years. We weren't kids anymore, me in my early 30s, Matt a few years behind, but the weight of old arguments hung heavy. Our fallout had been messy, filled with words that couldn't be taken back. Yet, as time passed, regret seeped in. I missed him. That's why I planned this trip. Just the two of us in a remote cabin, away from the noise and distractions, hoping we could mend the cracks in our bond. The cabin was deep in the Adirondacks, a 3-hour drive from Albany. It was late October, and the leaves had turned, casting the forest in golds and reds. The air was crisp, with a hint of winter creeping in. Perfect weather for a weekend of fishing and hiking. The cabin itself wasn't anything fancy. It was old, with creaking wooden floors and a faint musty smell, but it had the essentials: a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and 2 twin beds. No electricity, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. That was the point. The first day went better than I'd hoped. We unpacked, settled in, and spent the afternoon fishing by a nearby lake. Matt was quieter than I remembered, but he smiled more than I'd seen in years. That night, we cooked the fish over the stove and shared stories from when we were kids. For the first time in a long while, it felt like things were falling back into place. The second day started the same, calm and peaceful. We decided to hike one of the nearby trails. Matt brought a small backpack with some snacks and water, and I carried the map and a flashlight just in case. The forest was stunning, with sunlight filtering through the trees. About an hour into the hike, Matt stopped to tie his boot. I walked a little ahead, then paused to wait for him. When I turned around, he wasn't there. At first, I thought he was messing with me. He had a knack for pranks when we were kids, and I figured he was hiding behind a tree, waiting to jump out and scare me. "All right, Matt, very funny," I called out. No response. I laughed it off and walked back to where I'd last seen him. The spot was empty. I scanned the trees, calling his name, expecting him to pop out with a grin. Still nothing. Minutes turned into an hour. I retraced our steps, shouting his name louder, but the forest seemed to swallow my voice. My annoyance turned to worry. What if he'd gotten turned around or wandered off the trail? I decided to head back to the cabin, thinking he might have gone there. When I arrived, the cabin was empty. His backpack was gone, which meant he hadn't returned. I stood on the porch, staring at the tree lean, my chest tightening. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the golden light had turned to shadow. By nightfall, panic set in. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back into the woods, calling his name until my throat was raw. The forest at night was a different world, silent except for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle in the bushes. Every sound made my skin crawl. I found no sign of him, no footprints, nothing. It was as if he'd vanished. When I returned to the cabin, exhausted and shaking, I noticed something odd. The door, which I was certain I'd left closed, was slightly ajar. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the dark. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I saw it. Muddy footprints on the wooden floor. They weren't mine. I froze, my mind racing. Someone had been inside while I was gone. I checked every corner of the cabin, my heart pounding, but it was empty. The footprints led from the door to the window and then stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, my ears straining for any sound. The forest outside felt alive, pressing in on the thin walls of the cabin. The next morning, I decided to search the woods again. This time, I brought a hunting knife from the cabin. As I walked, I noticed things I hadn't before. Snapped branches, patches of disturbed leaves, and something that made my stomach drop. A small piece of fabric caught on a bush. It was from Matt's jacket. I called his name again, my voice breaking, but there was no answer. I kept moving, following what I hoped were signs of his trail. Then I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A small campsite hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't much, just a fire pit, some old cans, and a crude shelter made of branches. But what chilled me was the pile of items in the corner. A pair of boots, a jacket, and a torn backpack. None of it belonged to Matt, but it was clear someone had been living here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't alone out here. I ran back to the cabin, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't just abandon Matt. Back inside, I locked the door and pushed a chair under the handle. I tried to gather my thoughts, but my mind kept circling back to one thing. Whoever was out there knew we were here. That night, as I sat in the dark, I heard it. A soft tapping on the window. My blood ran cold. The curtains were drawn, and I didn't dare move. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, then stopped. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed a bag with food, water, and the knife and set out again. This time, I wasn't just looking for Matt. I was looking for whoever was out there. The forest felt hostile now, every shadow a potential threat. I followed the trail I'd found the day before, past the campsite, deeper into the woods. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing perfectly still. It wasn't Matt. I ducked behind a tree, my heart hammering. The figure was tall, dressed in ragged clothes, and holding something in their hand. A stick, maybe, or a weapon. They didn't move, just stood there, facing the direction of the cabin. I waited until they were out of sight, then hurried back. When I reached the cabin, the door was wide open. Inside, the place was trashed. Furniture overturned, cupboards emptied, the stove cold and dead. But Matt's backpack was on the floor. I grabbed it and ran, not stopping until I reached the car. I drove straight to the nearest town and called the authorities. They organized a search party, but no trace of Matt was ever found. Weeks later, I got a call from the police. They'd found footprints near the cabin, but no leads. The case was closed as an unexplained disappearance. I've replayed those days in my head countless times, trying to piece together what happened. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to those woods. It had been a long, exhausting few months. The breakup had hit me hard, harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I had depended on someone else until I was left alone with my thoughts. My mind seemed like a blur of emotions, regrets, and questions. That's why, when my friend Sarah offered me her family's cabin for a weekend, I didn't think twice. I needed the break. I needed silence. I needed to feel something other than the ache of loss. The cabin was about 2 hours outside of town, deep in the woods. Sarah had warned me it was secluded, but that's exactly what I wanted.
No distractions, no reminders.
Just the trees, the dirt, and the air. The idea of being surrounded by nature sounded perfect, far removed from everything I'd left behind. When I arrived late on Friday evening, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the shadows from the trees seemed to stretch forever. The cabin was exactly as I remembered from the few visits I'd made as a kid. Wooden, a little run down but cozy. It was small but functional, with just enough space for one person to escape into. It had no cell service, which I found strangely comforting. There would be no calls, no messages, no noise. I unpacked my bag, made some tea, and sat by the fire in the small living room. I didn't feel afraid. There was something reassuring about being alone, about having nothing but the crackling of the fire to keep me company. I let the warmth of the flames pull me into a sense of peace, a brief moment of calm that I desperately needed. That first night was uneventful. I slept soundly, the rhythmic chirping of crickets outside lulling me into a deep sleep. But on the second night, things started to feel different. Started slowly. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise outside, a soft rustling, like someone moving through the leaves. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe an animal out there. I convinced myself to ignore it. The wind had a way of playing tricks in these woods, but the rustling continued. Then, I heard it, a faint tap, like something hitting the side of the cabin. My heartbeat quickened, but I still brushed it off. It had to be an animal, right? Maybe a squirrel or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I lay back down, trying to force myself to sleep again, but my mind kept racing. The wind outside grew stronger, howling now, and the trees creaked under its pressure. Yet, the sound of movement didn't stop. It sounded closer this time, like someone was walking around the cabin, deliberately avoiding the spots where the light from the windows shone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I needed to shake off the unease I felt, so I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows over the forest. The trees were tall, their branches swaying in the wind, and the ground was soft underfoot, littered with fallen leaves. As I walked around the cabin, something caught my eye. Footprints. They were fresh and they were human. I knelt down, tracing the edges of the prints with my fingers. There was no mistaking it. They were bare footprints, leading up to the back of the cabin and disappearing into the woods. I stood up, my heart starting to race. There was no way I'd missed someone walking around the cabin last night, but it didn't make sense. Sarah had said no one came up here. There weren't even neighbors for miles. And yet, these prints told a different story. That afternoon, I tried to keep my mind busy. I read a little, made some lunch, and went for another walk, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. But it couldn't. As evening rolled in, I decided to call Sarah, just to check in. My phone, as expected, had no service, but I thought I could at least try the cabin's landline. When I picked it up, I was met with the familiar dial tone. I felt a small comfort in hearing it. But then, just as I was about to dial Sarah's number, the phone rang. I froze. It wasn't a wrong number, nor was it anyone from the area. The line went silent after 2 or 3 rings. I listened intently, but there was no sound, nothing but the faint hum of the connection. I slammed the receiver back down, unnerved. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything before I went to bed. I left the lights on in the living room, the only source of comfort in the otherwise dark house. But sleep didn't come easily. The cabin felt too quiet, too still. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls made me jump. I kept listening for sounds outside, the rustling I'd heard the night before, but nothing came. Just when I thought I could finally relax, there was a knock on the door. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't bring myself to look outside. The knocks continued, growing louder with each passing moment. It was as if someone was trying to get in. Slowly, I crept to the window and peeked outside. There was no one there, but when I turned back to the door, I saw something new. The marks, scratches, long and jagged, had appeared on the wooden surface of the door. It was as if someone had run their nails across it. Deep gouges in the wood, a message I couldn't understand. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I couldn't stay locked in the cabin forever, wondering who or what was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and walked around the perimeter of the cabin, hoping to find something that would make sense of the marks and the footprints. That's when I saw it. Behind a thicket of trees, just beyond the clearing where the cabin stood, was a small makeshift shelter. It wasn't much. A tarp draped over branches, some old blankets scattered around, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. Someone had been living here, not recently, but recently enough to leave traces. Cans of food were scattered around, some half buried in the dirt, others torn open, as if someone had been living off what they could find. I backed away from the shelter, my mind racing. The footprints, the strange noises, the phone call. It all made sense now. Someone had been watching me, staying hidden in the woods, and I had no idea how long they had been there. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I kept checking the locks, looking out the windows, even though I knew the answer would always be the same. Nothing. There was no one out there, but the fear kept growing, tightening around me like a vice. At around midnight, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't wait for the dial tone to fade. I picked it up, and a voice crackled through the speaker. No words, just static. But then, between the crackles, I thought I heard something. A faint whisper, barely audible, but enough to send chills down my spine. Leave now. The next morning, I didn't hesitate. I packed my things, grabbed the keys, and left the cabin without looking back. The woods, the cabin, the marks on the door, they felt like a bad dream, something I couldn't trust my mind to forget. I didn't care about the unanswered questions. All I wanted was to get away. As I drove down the long, winding road back to the nearest town, I took one last look in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent in the woods behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still out there watching, waiting. And no matter how far I went, I couldn't forget the feeling that I wasn't alone. I haven't been back to Sarah's cabin since. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear the faint echo of footsteps in the woods, and I wonder if I'll ever truly be free of what I felt out there. But I don't think I'll ever find the answers. Some things are better left in the dark. It's early November in the mountains of Maine when I get the call. The last thing I want to do is head to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, but it's a job and it pays well. I'm Jack Marshall, 48 years old, a seasoned repairman. I've worked on everything from heating systems in old farmhouses to running electrical in new suburban homes. But this one's different. The job is simple enough. Fix the heating in a cabin deep in the woods, where a family has been living off the grid. What I don't expect is the unease that creeps over me as soon as I step onto the property. The sun's low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground as I pull up to the cabin. The road to get here was nothing more than a barely visible path through thick trees, and I can't shake the feeling that I've been driving forever. My truck's engine sputters to a halt, and I sit there for a second, taking it all in. The cabin is older than most, built from dark logs that seem to absorb the sunlight. The roof has patches where the shingles have peeled away. I know it's probably just age, but the place looks abandoned. Even with the truck parked out front, it doesn't look like anyone lives here. Not really. The small patch of yard is overgrown, weeds creeping into the cracks of the stone path leading to the front door. My boots crunch against the leaves as I walk up, hearing the sound of my breath in the cold air. The door opens and I see the man. He's old, maybe in his 70s, with a weathered face and a glare that immediately tells me he's not thrilled to see me. His clothes are worn and faded, a rough flannel shirt over jeans, and he stands there, eyes narrow, arms crossed. I'm not the first repairman he's seen, I can tell that. But he doesn't seem to care much about the fact that I've been called to help. "You're the repairman?" he grunts, his voice thick with suspicion. "I don't like strangers." I nod, trying to ease the tension. "I'm just here to get your heating working again. Shouldn't take more than a day, maybe two." His eyes flick over me, scanning me like he's trying to figure out if I'm trustworthy. Then he steps aside, grumbling something under his breath. His daughter, younger than him by at least 20 years, stands behind him, her arms folded. She's the one who actually made the call. She seems a little more welcoming, though she's definitely not thrilled to be here either. "We're just trying to get the place comfortable," she says, her voice a little strained, as if she's said this 100 times. "Dad's just protective. He doesn't like people, but he doesn't mean any harm." I shrug it off. People can be quirky. I've been around enough to know that. I step inside, and the first thing that hits me is the smell. It's musty, like the air's been trapped inside for too long. The cabin is dark, with only the faintest light filtering through the heavy curtains. The old man leads me down a narrow hallway to the basement, where the heating system is. I'm not expecting anything fancy, just an old furnace that needs a bit of TLC. But when I see it, my stomach drops. It's worse than I thought. The furnace is ancient. There's rust on the pipes, the vents are clogged with dust and cobwebs, and the whole system looks like it hasn't been touched in decades. I grab my tools, feeling the weight of the job ahead of me. The old man hovers at the top of the stairs, watching me. Every so often, I catch him muttering something under his breath, but he never says anything directly to me. It's almost like he's waiting for something. By the time I've spent hours cleaning the system and replacing a few key parts, I'm exhausted. The daughter's nowhere to be found, and the old man has disappeared too. It's getting dark outside, the sky turning a deep blue as the cold sets in. I finish up the last of my work, feeling a sense of accomplishment. I'm ready to head home, but when I go upstairs, I find the door locked. I knock, but no one answers. I don't like the idea of staying overnight, but it looks like I'm stuck. There's no phone service, no internet, nothing. I'm cut off from the world, and I don't like the feeling. The shadows inside the cabin seem to grow longer as the night drags on. I try the door again. Locked. I walk around the house, but everything is still, unnervingly so. It's too quiet. There's no sign of either of the two people who live here. The old man is nowhere to be found, and his daughter seems to have vanished. The only sound is the occasional creak of the floorboards under my boots. That's when I hear it, a soft tapping, like someone gently knocking on wood. But I know it's not the door. I follow the sound, which seems to come from the walls themselves. I feel a chill run through me, and for the first time that day, I regret accepting this job. I'm not scared of the dark. Not really, but something's off about this place. The tapping stops as suddenly as it started, but it leaves a lingering sense of unease. I try to leave again, this time heading for my truck, but when I get outside, I see that it's been tampered with. The tires have been slashed, the windshield is cracked, and the engine doesn't start. My stomach drops. I can't even get a hold of anyone to help me. It's as if I'm trapped here with no way out. I walk around the cabin again, trying to find another way to leave, but the place is surrounded by thick woods. I could hike out, but with no map, I'm not sure where I'd end up. The cold air bites at my skin as I walk, trying to find anything that might tell me what's going on. And then I hear it again, the tapping, louder now, closer. I turn around, but no one's there. I'm alone, or so I think. Suddenly, the front door creaks open, and I hear the old man's voice. I told you not to mess with things you don't understand. I freeze. He's standing there in the doorway, a dark figure silhouetted against the faint light from inside. I can barely make out his face, but I know that look. It's the same look he gave me when I first arrived. The look of someone who's been hiding something for a long time. You don't belong here, he mutters, his voice low and dangerous. You shouldn't have come. I take a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. There's something wrong with this place. Something about the way he says it, the way he stands there watching me. I'm not sure what I'm dealing with, but I know I need to get out. I rush for the back door, but before I can reach it, I hear a thud, a heavy step behind me. I turn just in time to see the old man's daughter step into the room, her face twisted into something unrecognizable, like she's been changed by the isolation, by whatever has been going on here. She's different now, colder. We didn't want anyone to find out, she says, her voice colder than the air around us. But now you know too much. I don't know what that means, but I know that I'm in deep. This isn't just some weird family dynamic. There's something else here, something darker. I back away, searching for a way out, but the door slams shut behind me.
I'm trapped.
There's no escape. Hours pass. I don't know how long I've been sitting in the dark, but I know I can't stay here. The tension is unbearable. I need to get out. The tapping starts again, closer this time, but I don't look. I can't. Finally, I hear a truck outside. It's not mine. It's someone else. A voice calls from the driveway, and the old man's daughter steps outside, speaking with someone I can't see. A few minutes later, the door opens, and I find myself face to face with the sheriff. His expression is grave. "Jack Marshall?" he asks, confirming my identity. "You all right?" I nod, still trying to understand what just happened. "We've been looking for you," the sheriff says. "You were reported missing a couple days ago. Your truck was found a mile down the road, abandoned. The old man and his daughter are gone.
No trace.
It's like they were never there. There's no sign of foul play, no sign of anything strange, just an old cabin in the woods." As I get into the sheriff's truck, I can't shake the feeling that I've narrowly escaped something. I don't know if it was the isolation or if it was something deeper, but I know this: some places aren't meant to be visited. and some people shouldn't be left alone in the dark.